Good morning, everyone. Morning, I think it's 10 o'clock, so we will begin the meeting. Welcome to today's meeting of the Scrutiny Commission. As usual, this meeting is being broadcast live to the public, and for those who are not able to watch it live, the webcast will be recorded and made available for viewing on the County Council's website after the meeting. We've had apologies from Mr. Morgan today, so welcome to Mr. King, who's acting as his substitute at this meeting. So we move on to item 1, which is the minutes from the last meeting held on the 8th of November 2023. I move that these are taken as read, confirmed and signed. Is that agreed? Yeah. Okay. And moves on to item 2, which is question time. I've not received any questions from the public for this meeting. Item 3 is questions asked by members under Standing Order 7. I've not received any such questions. Item 4, urgent items. We have no urgent items, and the item 5 is the declarations of interests. I'm assuming that all members who are also members of district borough councils will wish to declare an interest in relation to all the medium-term financial strategy items. Do any members have any other interests they wish to declare? No. Okay. Item 6 is declaration of the party whip. Do any members wish to declare the party whip? No. Item 7, I've not received any petitions, so it moves us therefore on to the first substantive item, which is the provisional medium-term financial strategy 2024-25 to 2027-28. Declan Keegan, the Director of Corporate Resources, is introducing the report, supported by Simone Hines, the Assistant Director, the Leader, Mr. Rushden, and the Lead Member for Resources, Mr. Brecken, are also here for this item. Welcome to you all. We've obviously got the separate schedule, which hopefully members have for the MTFS items, where we're breaking it down into the different sections. So if we hand over to you, Declan, to make a start. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. I was just going to say a few words to give a little bit of context, then pass over to Simone, who'll go through the sort of the nuts and bolts of the report. I mean, every sort of January, we seem to come here and say, you know, this is the hardest ever budget. And sort of said, I've had a bit of a look back at sort of our previous budgets, and it's been 3 years since we've last been able to balance the first 2 years of the MTFS without having to use reserves. And in the last couple of years, we've only been able to sort of clear the first year without sort of the use of the reserve. So, and actually, this is the first time ever that we're having to sort of present a budget where the next financial year is requiring reserves to balance it. So we are in that sort of creeping death kind of situation. I mean, it's not great, and the sort of the local and the national forecasts don't suggest this is going to sort of change anytime soon. So it genuinely is our sort of our hardest budget. You can see that sort of playing out in the numbers and the national narrative, and it's one that we're just going to have to get sort of used to, because there's no respite on the horizon. The only good news is that our positioning relative to other authorities is relatively good. You know, we're not near that kind of the section 114 concern type authorities. You know, we're not in conversation with the government about exceptional financial support. So that is the kind of the light at sort of the end of the tunnel, and a lot of other people get into a lot of trouble before us. So I'll pass over to Simone to go through the report itself. Thank you.
Thank you. I will go through the report in some detail, but I will pause at the appropriate moments to invite any questions. So as Declan's already outlined, the report provides an update on the Council's medium-term financial strategy, and it covers the 2024 to 2028 period. The report's got a particular focus on the corporate and central items and the Council's overall financial position, and that's because the service-related budgets have been considered already by the appropriate scrutiny panel. So this report follows on from the draft MTFS, which was reported to Cabinet just before Christmas. And at that point, the strategy forecast a gap of around £12 million for 24-25, rising to around £85 million by 27-28, the final year of the strategy. There have been a small number of changes since that, most of them arising from the provisional local government finance settlement, which was announced just before Christmas. There's a table at section 9 of the report which goes through what those changes have been since the cabinet report was drafted. The most significant one there is a reduction to the services grant, which is one of the grants that comes through the settlement. That has been reduced more than we were expecting. We had forecast some reductions, but the government had gone further in that. And then there's been some minor changes to tax base forecasts and council tax forecasts as a result of districts and boroughs firming up their tax base forecasts. So at the point that this report was drafted, the scrutiny report was drafted, there was a slightly increased shortfall of 12.7 million for next financial year, with the gap by 27-28 remaining at around the £85 million mark. And then just while it's not in the papers, because it wasn't announced until after the paper service committee had been finalised, just wanted to highlight that there was a ministerial statement announced last Thursday, which did announce 600 million of additional funding for local government, 500 million of which was for social care. Now, allocations of that money won't be confirmed until the final local government settlement, which we're expecting early February, so I imagine it'll be next week, but we don't know that for sure. But it's likely that any additional income from that announcement will be used to reduce the council's shortfall, so reduce that 12.7 million that I've just mentioned. And we are expecting that funding just to be one-off at this point. In the absence of anything else, we're assuming that it will just be one-off funding for 24-25. But again, we won't know that until the settlement comes out in early February. What we have been doing since the cabinet report as well is doing an exercise to identify further savings across directorates, and the outcome of that exercise will be reported to cabinet as part of the final report on the 9th of February. Just before I pause, I think just to sum up really those opening paragraphs of the report, that it is clear that the council is in a very challenging situation, as many local authorities are, with use reserves needed for 24-25, and then a gap of 33 million forecasting 25-26. So quite urgent action will be needed to identify savings to close that gap in the very sort of short term. And it also is quite difficult for the council to plan ahead now with the sort of uncertainty around national government funding, national government policy, and of course a general election due. So that does add quite a bit of uncertainty to the MTFS this time as well. But I will just pause there and see if I've got any questions before I move on.
Anyone have any questions on that part of the report? So we're looking at paragraphs 1 to 18, Appendix A, 19 to 34, Appendix B. No. Okay, if you want to carry on, Simone, thank you.
So the next sections, and I'm going to cover section sort of 19 to 34 of the report, and that just goes into a bit more detail about some of the corporate and central elements of the budget. And there is Appendix B, which goes through that in more detail as well. Just a couple of key points here. So the budget does include a risk contingency, as it has in previous years, and that does provide a sort of degree of resilience against any in-year fluctuations, such as increased service demand or further inflationary increases. And that has in the past actually allowed the council to kind of manage any increased costs in year without reliance on reserves or without needing to agree any in-year reductions. And we are likely to be needing to use that risk contingency this year as well. So it does show that it is an important element of the budget. There is also a contingency in the MTFS for inflation, both for pay and price, and we do hold that centrally because costs aren't known at the point that the MTFS is approved. So the pay award, for instance, for future years isn't yet agreed. So that's held centrally, and we'll release it to service budgets as it becomes known. And we have also made assessments about what we think future demand and growth is likely to be across services. So looking at what we expect sort of demographic change to be and where extra demand is likely to be, we have made a provision for that in the MTFS, so we have got cover for that in future years. So again, that covers sort of sections 19 to 34 of the report and Appendix B, but again, we'll just pause there, see if there's any specific questions on those parts.
Mr. Richardson.
Thank you, Chair. Just a very quick one on paragraph 33. I couldn't find it anywhere in the accounts, but just out of interest, what is our net income from ESPO? Because I couldn't find the information. I appreciate it says it's gone up by 80,000, but I couldn't find what our net income was anywhere.
For the current year, the budget is in the region of 800k. Yeah, for the current financial year. And then we have got a slight stretch target. I think it's up to 900k for 24-25.
Sorry, if I can, through you, Chair. Are we on track for the 800,000?
Yes.
And in fact, presumably more now if we got an increase. So we've said here, haven't we, a saving of 80,000. Presume that's the increase in net income.
Yes, so there is an increased income target for 24-25,
right,
and they are on track to achieve that in the current year.
Thank you very much.
Does any other members have? Yeah, Mr. King.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Just to help clarify in my mind, so talking about contingency figures, I'm looking at Appendix A. So the contingency, we've got MTFS risks contingency, and then we've got contingency for inflation and living wage. Now, is it the case, are we expecting we're actually going to need to use all those contingencies, and that's why they're shown in the kind of revenue expenditure outgoing column, if I can put it like that? And that's so whatever we do, we're still expecting to have to spend that. It's not just a fund, if I can put it like this, rainy day fund we're putting to one side, which we might have to use, but we just kind of an accounting, shall we say, thing that you've put together. And because I noticed that obviously the contingency is much greater than the variance, i.e. the deficit that we're forecasting each year. So I'm just wondering if those two things aren't kind of interrelated. If we're not going to use all the contingency, presumably then the variance, i.e. deficit, will come down, because you'll be putting that back in. Am I right in that assumption?
So
thank you.
Thank you. So the inflation contingency, that is our estimate of what inflation is going to cost the council in each year of the MTFS. The reason that we hold it centrally as a contingency is that we don't have confirmed, say, pay award, for instance. So we don't allocate it to directorates at this point because we don't know what the pay award is. We've made assumptions about what we think the pay award will be, as well as the national living wage, and also things like utility inflation as well. So we've made assumptions and we hold that centrally, and then we allocate it as we need it. But we are expecting certainly the inflation contingency will be needed in each year of the MTFS, and we've made assessments about what we think that will need to be.
Just to give a bit of comfort, we do reset that each year effectively. So if we're under or over, then as we go through the MTFS cycle, we sort of rebuild that. So it never builds up to sort of a rainy day fund, as it were. It does kind of, if we didn't need the inflation, it then gets released for the other services, and then we make a new estimate of inflation.
So what you're saying is it comes back in then to the revenue when we can release it. Yeah, okay, that's great. Thank you.
Any other members? No. Okay. Back to you, Simone.
Thank you. The next section then I'm going to go through is the section on earmark reserves and the robustness of the estimates. And this is a really key element of the budget's process to review the council's level of earmark reserves and also the level of risk that the council's facing to make sure those reserves are reasonable compared to the level of risk. And at this point, the 151 officer also has to give assurance to the council when approving the budget that the council does hold reasonable reserves, and also that the estimates that have been used in building up the budget are reasonable. So that the report does include that. And as part of that assessment, it is important to include an assessment of risk, again, just so we have a clear link back to the risk that the council's facing and how we're covering those risks. And you can see that at section 36 of the report, where it goes through that in detail. There's then a summary of the council's reserves position at paragraphs 39 to 44, both the general fund, which is the council's reserve to cover sort of in-year unexpected fluctuations, and then earmarked reserves, which are held for specific purposes. The council's general fund balance is estimated to stand at around 20 million at the end of the current financial year. Now that is slightly below the target that the council sets in its strategy to hold in terms of that general fund balance. So there is, within the MTFS, there is provision to increase that general fund balance, and it is then due to increase to 24 million by the end of the MTFS period, which is then just about within the region that we would want it to be. Then earmarked reserves. So we have revenue earmarked reserves held for specific projects and future spend. They're estimated to be 75 million at the end of the year. And then there's capital reserves as well, which are used to fund the capital programme in future years. They're estimated to stand at 126 million. And again, you've got further details of both of those at Appendix C. But again, I'll just pause to take any questions on those sections.
Mr. Richardson.
Thank you, Chair. Probably the wrong place to ask it, but I don't know where else to ask it. But I was reading paragraph 36 when it says non-achievement of savings and income targets. And my mum always used to say to me, look after the pennies and the pounds to take care of themselves. And at this time when we are, as Declan says, in the financial situation where every penny counts, could I just ask how much we're contributing towards the provision of union officers and space for union in this building? Is it a legal requirement? And really, is it something our residents will be expecting us to do at this time, is to pay for services which members themselves are providing through their union subs?
I don't have that detail to hand, but we can issue that. We can go back and check for that information and issue that to the committee afterwards if that would be helpful, unless Declan has it.
We've got Gordon's coming along later for the corporate resources item. So if I suggest if you pick it up, then he'll be able to give us sort of a fuller response. So I'll drop him a message now to just forewarn him. Thank you.
And Mr. King.
Yeah, it's just a query on section paragraph 36. In there it says, I think it's about the fourth bullet point down, there's this accumulated deficit of 112 million is anticipated by 27-28. Now I'm looking at the Appendix A. Is that the cumulative deficit according to Appendix A, the balance, the kind of expenditure and funding, and adding the variances each year up, or what is that cumulative deficit referring to? Is that SEN expenditure? Where's that shown then in the balance, in the kind of appendix? It's not shown. Because that's off balance sheet, is it?
Yes, okay, to just come back in to clarify. Yes, so at the moment, the government has allowed a statutory override for the deficit on our SEND expenditure. So that deficit is held on the balance sheet. There is a temporary government provision that allows us to do that, as all local authorities are in that position, not just Leicestershire. And that is just a temporary override that allows us to do that. We are still awaiting kind of a permanent solution to the DSG deficit. But at the moment, that override, I think, is due to end in 2026. But that is the position, so that deficit is held on the balance sheet. You won't see that cumulative deficit in the budget position itself.
Okay, Chair, if I may, if I could just explore this a little bit then. So at the moment, this 112 million, this is by 2026 then. Okay, and how long have we had this override off balance sheet deficit for?
4 years, I think. It's
4
been
years
a number
today.
of years, but it's a government statutory override.
No, I appreciate that. I'm just trying to understand how long. And at the moment, we don't know what the government is proposing to do about it, but looks like it's a pass after the general election.
There are some initiatives that are supposed to support local authorities in managing their DSG deficit. So there is the safety valve programme for those that have sort of the highest deficits, and then there's the delivering better value in SEND, which is a programme with government support, DFE support, that the council is part of. And of course, we do have the work ongoing to identify further savings and reduce this deficit going forward. But at the moment, there is kind of some uncertainty about how it will be dealt with long term.
There's money coming out of the council's revenue expenditure above and beyond what you're showing on the chart here.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
I'll just add quickly to that, government's line still is they expect authorities to eliminate that deficit. The problem is the longer this goes on, the less realistic that feels it's going to be. So they haven't cracked it yet, but that is still the official line. And at the moment, they're asking authorities who've got a deficit, what will you do if the statutory override disappears? Which obviously kind of, if you drop all that sort of deficit onto authorities in one go, it's going to cause chaos. So.
Mrs. Hack.
Thank you. My question was on exactly the same point. So 1112, on top of the 85 million. That's the reality. Is actually our SEND deficit will be greater than the whole authority's deficit by itself. My understanding that's about 4.6 billion nationally, and there are 20 authorities that have had their SEND deficit wiped. So I suppose the question is that how the savings that we've been trying to make haven't yet or broken us even. Is there a point at which in the 4 years we will get to that?
So just correct a couple of bits. The cumulative deficit for SEND is cash, so it's built up over several years, where the 80 million we quote about is a single year income versus expenditure gap. So they're not quite like with like. If you compare them like with like, it's probably closer to sort of the 20 million mark on SEND between the income expenditure gap. The savings been sort of working on, I suppose, a while. There's been sort of the initial wave, I suppose, was trying to sort of do extra building to sort of just increase that sort of level of local provision. We've got Newton in at the moment, and we've been doing sort of quite a lot of sort of piloting and testing work to sort of try and get that sort of level of inclusion up within schools. So that's work that's ongoing at the moment, and they're gradually kind of that work is gradually starting to have an impact. It's probably fair to say until sort of recently it was more in the sort of pilot phase. So the target of that work will bring the income expenditure deficit down to about £10 million on an annual basis, which is still significant, but sort of much better than it could have been. And then there's plans to have a phase 2 work to sort of just identify where we could kind of continue to keep reducing that deficit. We obviously work with the DfE on this in terms of their sort of having the overview of the plans and sort of take that feedback. I think one important point to note is that kind of nobody's kind of, as I touched on, nobody's cracked this. And even if we entered the safety valve programme, government don't tend to wipe the deficit. They tend to do a bit of a deal where they'll kind of basically say the authority has to put so much money in from general fund, schools have to transfer so much money in, and then DfE will put a bit of money in there as well. But it does tend to be kind of, I don't know, there's an awful lot of consuming your own smoke. And then the expectation still is you've got to fix that income expenditure gap. They never increase the annual amount of income that you get. So it very much is, no matter how much DfE are working with us, the onus is on us to do something different locally to sort of solve that problem.
Did you have a question, Mr. Rees? Oh, Mr. Bartley.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. The auditors seem to rate it as being a well-run council and everything else, but very simplistically, we simply haven't got enough money because we're limited to what we can raise on council tax. Inflation is taking place. The demands are going up. The population is increasing. I mean, you don't have to be a genius to know that's going to cause a deficit, but nobody seems to be acknowledging that or doing anything about it. We've talked about being the lowest funded council for years, and we go to Parliament and it's almost just swept under the table. 112 million deficit on SEND. Well, you can't get away from it. I don't think it's a question of that we're not doing things. I mean, are we doing everything we possibly can to help ourselves? Well, there probably are some areas we could tighten up on, but probably more worrying, this isn't just a problem that's unique to Leicestershire County Council. I think the auditors have already said we're probably in a stronger position than most, but it is very worrying. It's almost as though it's the king's clothes of pretending it's not there. But it clearly is. I'm not criticising, but it's just remarkable that nobody seems to acknowledge it, and that there are ways of addressing it, but the government is very reluctant to do it. I think any government would be very reluctant to do it, but all we can do is do the best we possibly can and make sure we're not wasting money. And by the looks of things, in the main, we are doing exactly that. Would you agree?
No, I think that's a fair summary of the problem and a fair summary of where we are. Yeah.
Mr. Richardson, did you want to?
I was just going to make the similar point to Tom. We raised this at corporate governance with the external auditors on Friday, as Declan knows. I mean, this is probably the single biggest financial risk to the council, to be honest. I mean, this is actually a bigger risk than adults and children's care, to be perfectly frank. And of course, whilst it's off balance sheet, you still have to pay for the debt, as Councillor King has said, which is going up out of our revenue budget each year. Now, we did ask the question of the external auditors, what was their view on this? And as Tom correctly says, the external auditors were extremely complimentary about what we're trying to do here compared to most councils. They recognise we get more bang from our buck, for want of a better phrase, than almost every other council. But the auditors themselves did actually say that they raise this regularly with central government because this is a countrywide issue. And in some way, shape or form, the only solution is at some point a government will have to put money in. And there is no other way around it. But if they don't, and if they expect us to clear the debt, I think it's at that point that probably almost every upper tier authority in the country will put in a 114 notice.
Any more comments? No. Okay. Right.
Thank you. The next section of the report then is the capital programme, and you can see that from paragraph 55 onwards. Relevant scrutiny committees have again reviewed the appropriate programmes for their committee. So again, the focus here largely is on the overall programme and funding position for the council. So just in summary, the programme for the next 4 years is just under 450 million. With funding available or funding identified so far of 355 million. So that does mean that at the moment the council has a capital funding gap of about 93 million. And that will be covered by borrowing if no further funding is identified by the point at which it's needed. And of course, for the capital programme, borrowing is a reasonable funding source. Where possible, we will look to use some of the council's internal cash balances to fund that gap rather than having to go out and externally borrow and incur interest. But it may well be that over the 4 years, there are periods where we do choose to externalise some of that borrowing because it makes sense with either with interest rates or the way that the council's cash balances are at that point. Worth noting there that the shortfall has reduced by almost 30 million since the previous version of the MTFS, so that capital gap has reduced. That's largely because of the removal of the MMDR South project, as well as identifying some further funding. Also, just to point out, there is provision for future developments in the programme, so we have made provision for any future capital schemes that may need to be added for various reasons. There is some contingency in there, but it is going to be really important for the council to continue to prioritise capital projects very sort of robustly and to reduce the sort of risk of having to forward fund projects where possible as well, given that position. And there are further details of the capital programme in Appendix F and the more detailed funding sources as well. Again, I'll just pause for questions there.
Thank you. Does anyone have any questions of Mr. Richardson?
Thank you, Chair. I know there's been some recent announcements, I think it's from Midlands Connect, about funding that might be available due to the scrapping of HS2, the next leg, and infrastructure investment. So I don't know if we've got any indication whether there's any good news there on routes that we would expect that we might have to fund where additional money would be coming in. But additionally, is it true? I mean, I've looked at the figures and D2N2 are going to get 1.1 billion over 10 years. And the inference report was that had we joined D2N2, there would have been some 500 or 600 million available for Leicester and Leicestershire over the next 10 years for capital infrastructure. So is it the case that the unwillingness of the Leicester City Mayor to stand down is actually meaning that the people of Leicester and Leicestershire will have hardly any infrastructure because we will not get that money?
Yeah, just in terms of the first point, there is some additional funding from the Council of HS2 that is coming through to the council largely through additional highways maintenance allocations. Actually, now the first two years of that, we have got those allocations. They're fairly small. I think it's about 2 to 2.5 million. It is then due to ramp up in later years, but we don't know what those allocations are as yet. So for the moment, we are just working on the smaller allocations that we know about for the first 2 years. And then in terms of the point about Devo, I'll let Declan.
In terms of where there's been sort of an established combined authority, the government do give those combined authorities an investment fund, and that investment fund is ring fenced for, as it says on on the tin sort of investment, but sort of overseen by sort of a government framework. So you can't use it for your day-to-day revenue budgets, but you can use it, as you've alluded to, for sort of infrastructure of the sort of the wider area. So not participating in the combined authority does mean that we don't get access to that fund. Exactly how much it'd be does vary quite a bit deal by deal, but it is the sort of tens of millions sort of per annum, as it were. So yeah, we don't get that funding. There is other funding pots as well that the government does kind of earmark towards combined authorities that you don't get access to either. But yeah, so how much we miss out, I don't know, but we definitely do miss out on infrastructure funding.
Mr. King, did you have?
Yeah, thanks, Chair. Sort of following on a similar kind of track, really. So just on this section, county councils, what we're saying is that in the future, infrastructure investments, we're going to be looking to forward fund infrastructure. That's whether it be highways or whether it be schools and all of that sort of stuff. And so there's two things here. One, just thinking about schools, I'm just wondering how strategically we're looking at particularly school investment, because one of the obviously contributing factors to the SEN deficit, and particularly in south of Leicestershire, is the considerable distance that pupils have to travel, and also the rapid population growth that's taken place over the last 20 years. So I'm just wondering how we're looking at that strategically, whether we're actually crunching the data sufficiently well to actually predict where the kind of pressures are going to be in the next 10, 15 years. But just in terms of this, and thinking back to obviously the challenging situation that we had with Melton and the kind of getting the distributor road agreed, what's been done to ensure that we don't hit the kind of same challenging situation with the district councils in terms of agreeing the kind of approach to local plan making and infrastructure investment, because what we don't want to end up with, no authority, is delay on delivery of critical infrastructure, so that development doesn't happen, and infrastructure, because obviously delay to infrastructure costs go up, so as we know. So I'm just trying to understand what we're doing. And finally, kind of related point, just in a section, I think it's in one of the appendices, Appendix E, it talks about under the section 106, page 47, talks about something called area strategies. I'm just wondering what an area strategy is and how's that going to be sort of decided, agreed. Is that county coming up with an area strategy and telling the district planning, this is our plan for your area, or is it a co-produced, co-agreed strategy? Just like to understand that. Thank you.
Just on the first question, firstly around schools and that strategic planning. So just to give some assurance, there is a corporate group that does meet regularly and does that strategic planning. So it looks at where new places are likely to be needed, where actually there might be surplus places, and then the best way of delivering those new facilities, where they're likely to be, and the best way of delivering those and achieving value for money. So there is that group that does do that strategic thinking. And then in terms of the infrastructure points, I think there is and will continue to need to be that close working with the districts through their local plans. And I think the area strategies are a product of those. I don't know whether Declan wants to come in on that.
I mean, I think it does boil often down to that as early engagement as possible as the local plans develop. So the kind of, I suppose, the district's view of where the sort of settlements place or how they're grouped together is mindful of sort of the infrastructure costs that come with it. And I think that's all, to be honest, that's all we can do to a certain extent, because obviously the local plans are a district responsibility, highways is our responsibility, so it's just trying to get that, so we can try and find that sweet spot where we can kind of work together. So there's this continued effort to try and sort of put those forward, and as well it puts us in the best possible position for, you know, for sort of government funding for sort of infrastructure, but also sort of that coordination of developer funding. But one of the point I would stress is that one of the issues we have got at the moment is the sort of the viability of housing schemes. And the first thing that developers want to do if they're not viable is to sort of reduce their Section 106 commitments. So there is a certain element of developments may get held up if they can't sort of carry the burden of sort of the infrastructure funding, because we kind of, it's not a circle that we can square. You know, it's not our responsibility to actually deliver the housing, but we've got to kind of just make sure that we can sort of I don't know, put the best case forward for this is what, if it's a viable scheme, this is what the infrastructure is there to enable it. And the area strategy that are touched on is part of that, where we've obviously got multiple developers working in an area. It's just trying to make sure that we can kind of see that as a whole. So it's not just that the development gets held up because the first developer to sort of shove in the ground gets sort of clobbered with all the funding, but we're looking across the kind of the, maybe the 10 years of development that's involved. So that's part of the trying to sort of enable this. So we're not too dogmatic. It just, first developer has to sort of take the full load. You do look across the sort of all the development that's going to require that sort of highways infrastructure.
Do you want to come back?
Yeah, I mean, I'm still unclear how an area strategy is going to be agreed rather than imposed. I mean, I'm just trying to understand what that is. Who's going? Is it county come up with an area plan for delivering county-led infrastructure, or is it going to be co-produced with the districts via the local plan process? And I'm just trying to understand, and I still haven't got that clarity. And the second thing, just going back to what I mentioned, it wasn't necessarily just schools. It's also particularly about SEN. We talked earlier about huge deficit in SEN, which is related to transport. So clearly the issue is SEN centres where the schools are too far away because the transport costs are vast. So what are we doing to try and invest to ensure that SEN school provision is nearer to where, rapid growth. So if you take, for example, Market Harbour, for example, massive growth of population in the last 20 years. So therefore there are more kids with SEN, but there is no SEN school locally. So therefore kids have to travel a long way. And therefore, because they have to travel a long way, it's expensive. Is that, to put it simply. So I'm just wondering what we're doing to tackle that. And this seemed to be the appropriate moment to raise that.
Going back to the area strategies, no, absolutely, they have to involve the districts. I mean, just on a basic level, the districts decides the prioritisation of the Section 106. If you don't if you're not joined up on it, sort of the area strategy is very difficult to do. So no, absolutely, it's in coordination with sort of the districts and making sure that sort of Section 106 agreement is robust. In terms of the SEND piece, someone mentioned there is a sort of a team that does all the sort of the schools planning, and we're in a better shape than we used to do because government grant does now recognise a sort of a dedicated SEND allocation. We also include SEND on the Section 106s, so there is actually now funding coming in to do something about it. And they do look at sort of two different strategies. One is, do you expand the existing schools with sort of special units? You keep it sort of without having to sort of develop a sort of a full area special school. You keep it close to the school, but there's obviously sort of some children are going to have such significant needs that doesn't work. And then you start to look at whether is there enough pupils then of that specific kind of need type that you can justify a special school. So it is something that's ongoing at the moment. A lot of the funding does tend to come through, if we want it in addition to the capital programme, you have to bid from government for it. We've been successful in a couple of those bids, but they do take an awful lot, a long time. But there is that balance, like you say, between transport, but just making sure there's enough pupils of that specific need type to actually sort of trigger the need of a school.
Thank you, Declan, for that. Thank you, Councillor King. And I will say, until I read it on page 47, I wasn't aware. And rather than going into detailed explanation here, because it isn't really the forum, maybe we can have a little bit of a councillor briefing at a later date and go through how it works out and how it affects us all, because I'm sure the county councillors are very much interested in the area strategies of their division. If we can do that, thank you.
Okay, we can pick that up. The briefing will come from sort of the highways team as sort of do this day to day. So,
Mr. Boland.
Thank you very much. In terms of the capital programme, sort of the burden, if you like, on the county council when it comes to road infrastructure, school infrastructure and so forth that comes with new development. In Charnwood, we've had significant amount of development for what seems like forever, probably 5 years or more now. And I know we're trying to get Charnwood to agree to a framework in order to sort of get 106 funding in
to secure the investment needed in roads and so forth that they're not currently agreeing to do. But for me, this is a big issue, because the amount of infrastructure, the amount of development that we're getting and the pressure it's causing already on the existing road network is making life worse for the residents that are there. And for me, this is something that we I wonder at what point do we effectively say the effect on the road is such that it is, that we are going to start objecting to developments, because if Charnwood as the planning authority can't mitigate the problems caused by the development ultimately through 106, at what point do we start playing even more hardball and going, right, if you can't guarantee us that section 106 money for improved roads, then ultimately we're going to say the effect on the existing network is substantial, and at that point we start objecting, because unless we object, we form a borough hat on, you then don't give our borough councillors a chance to refuse applications on highways grounds, because they can't unless we object here, and we don't seem to object here. Yeah. And if we can't then guarantee that, if we can't guarantee that the development isn't going to have a substantially negative effect on the existing population, I think at what point do we then start going, no?
Councillor Poland, may I interrupt? I think that's a really valuable point, but if Declan makes a note of that, should we address that in a briefing? And then, because if you can make a note of that, we can look at that in a briefing rather than in a budget meeting. How about that?
Yeah, no, I'm happy to do that. It's more of a point than a question, but obviously it has a capital impact.
Thank you.
That's my purpose for it.
Thank you.
No, I find it's in a similar sort of theme of the briefing note you mentioned, so we can add it to that, because to be honest, it's kind of it's highways territory, because they are limited what they can actually sort of object to.
Any more comments, or Mr. Washington?
I think it's also worth, the developers sometimes appeal to the planning inspector about it. In my division, I've had a case recently where the planning inspector came back and said the health provision, there was no need for money within this application for further health provision, but the catchment area of the local practices was such that these new houses were going to put pressure on it. And so I know it's not easy, but I think the planning inspector needs to be aware, or much more granularly, of what is going on locally as far as provision of healthcare and stuff like that. But I won't say any more, because not much we can do about it, but it's something that we could take up with them.
Yeah, we can pick it up.
I think a briefing on the area strategies would be useful. If you don't have a briefing, just bring it to the relevant committee on what they are, because I can't get my head around entirely who's doing them. I know we've got them, but it'd be useful to have one. On the problem with the highway stuff, James, what is going to happen is that we have no money to build the roads anymore. So we have to wait until we get the money, and that will be the big difference going forward. So you're right, you'll be sweating the existing assets a lot more until we've got the money in. In the old days, we'd perhaps forward fund. I think you've got Section 106 coming in, not only for roads, but for education and all the plethora of other things that people rightly expect, because if you provide services and communities to people, they don't object as much as if you're building boxes of spine roads. But unfortunately, we won't be doing it the other way round. That we'll have to wait till we get the money in and then build the stuff. But it's a valid point that I don't know if the highways can actually object. They can say this is what's required. I don't think they can object. And I think the districts be unable to refuse, because they're under tremendous pressure to determine applications and get these houses built. And then finally, Chairman, on Terry's point, I honestly do think we are disadvantaged financially by not being in a level 3 deal. Now, we did originally, if you remember, Terry, as a group, we voted to accept a county-wide mayor on a level 3 deal. It wasn't universally popular in the group, but we voted for a mayor instead of a leader. And then when the final stuff came out from DLUC, there was a little bit at the bottom stuck in by the Treasury that it got to be a functional economic area. And they said Leicestershire County is not a functional economic area. You needed the city mayor. City mayor did not want to have another mayor above him. And politically, I presume at the time he thought he'd lose it to the Conservatives. So that deal went out. Then we had the D2N2, the so-called East Midlands Authority, which is a real misnomer. And I said to the, can we join that? And they told me, oh, no, you can't join that because you're not joining as a functional economic area. So we couldn't join D2N2 and be D2N2, L2 plus R, because we need to always think about what we're going to do with Rutland. So that was out. So now all we've got left on the table, and there has been meetings with the chief executives of the County Council, City Council and Rutland with DLUC officials to hammer out a so-called level 2 deal. And that is where we are. DLUC are kind of positive and want us to go for it. And I have a meeting coming up this week with the City Mayor to see if he will sign up to the level 2 deal, which DLUC tell us must be based on the Lancashire model. Whether or not he'll like the Lancashire model or not, I do not know until I meet him, but I am trying my best to get a level 2 deal. I have in the past referred to it as thin gruel, but apparently I'm not supposed to call it thin gruel anymore. But I'm advised that a level 2 deal is on offer if we can get the City Mayor and Rutland signed up. And at least then we'll have our foot in the door on devolution, because at the moment, as Simone has said, we've got some sweepings up coming from Network North with the promises of big money in the future from so-called Network North following the HS2 being cancelled. But it's all pie in the sky, really. You know, I and Lee couldn't put forward a budget on highways relying on money which we do not know what we're going to get. So all Simone and Declan and the team can do is put in a couple of 3 million, which we know we're getting. I mean, I'm going to parish councils now, and even they're talking about Network North money. When can I get some Network North money to do my traffic calming in my villages? I say, well, if there's some there, it's obviously going to be a political priority, but I can't promise you anything because they're talking 2026, 2027, 2028. I mean, we've all got our own elections in 2025. You know, it's really hard to tell people that there is money coming. They expect me to know, and I don't know. But I think Terry's point about us being financially disadvantaged by not having a devolution deal is correct.
Mr. Richardson.
Could I just thank Nick for that? I think that's a brilliant explanation. And I know it's we're going slightly outside the budget, though it is primarily on the budget because it's money. But last time I read the legislation, Nick, and it was a while ago, so it might have changed. My understanding is once you have a regional combined authority, we can then apply to join it without the city. Have we looked at that? Because that might be the way for us to get some money. And if the city don't get any money, I don't care if Sir Peter doesn't want his residents to have infrastructure, that's up to him. But I think it's very short-sighted of him.
What we'll have to do, Terry, is wait, because they've not even had their election yet. So that's coming up in May, I think. Our guy thinks he'll win it. Labour think they'll win it. We'll have to wait and see who wins it. But if they did let us join, we would have to be very, very careful. You know, we're not doing a deal with the devil, because we are, although we're kind of short of revenue money, we are, you know, we're a good financially sound county. And we don't want about Derbyshire, Nottinghamshire, or Derby City and Nottingham City. I don't want to be sent up to, say, the head office in Nottingham and constantly outvoted 4 votes to 1, and they take our money and impose stuff on us. If I had a city mayor there, at least then, you know, we're speaking as a whole. But I mean, I'm not opposed to asking, but you'd want to see the colour of their money and the structure about how we're going to be in there. Otherwise, they will just outvote us, in my view. But we'll have to wait and see, Michael, till once it comes up and take a decision about whether or not you want to send me to try and do a deal with them.
Thank you, Mr. Washington. Any other comments on that item? Mrs. Hack?
Just wanted to follow back on what Councillor King was saying with regards to special educational needs. It's clearly a huge issue for the authority. And whilst we can obviously have that conversation later on the agenda, because we've got the I don't know what the new abbreviation is, the new CAFE essentially, investing in Leicestershire, is clearly there is enough demand because the private sector has filled that in terms of special educational needs. And, you know, there's 380, 400 children now getting educated in the private sector with a special educational needs. So what work are we doing to try and provide places within the authority rather than utilising the private sector, which is more expensive and does put more demand on our revenue budget? So what capital work are we doing to try and long-term investor save on special educational needs?
So I think there's probably a sort of a blended approach actually to this in terms of through well, there's ILP, but there's also the social care improvement project as well, where we are looking at increasing the council's own provision, but then also one of the transformation work streams within children's is also around better commissioning strategies as well, around how we do secure external provision in a different way and for better value for money. And I think it's important actually that there's a range of provision that we use, you know, both internal and I think, you know, the external market has still got a role to play, and actually by having the best of both worlds, we do allow then to have a different range of provision to meet different needs at different levels, and hopefully get the best sort of value for money from that provision as well.
Okay, so that I think then moves on to the budget consultation.
Just very briefly, actually, on this, towards the end of the report, there is a section on the budget consultation. It closed, I think, on the 17th of January. We have had 450 responses. They are now being analysed, so that there isn't any feedback on that available as yet, but a summary of the responses will be included in the final MTFS report to Cabinet, which is on the 9th of February, but the outcome of the consultation will be published with the agenda later this week. So that's all I was going to add on that. Thank you.
Thank you, Simone. Anyone have any comments on the consultation? Mr. Barclay.
Through no fault of your own, that's statistically pretty insignificant, 450 responses. I mean, it's really, how much value can you put on that?
I think we have been discussing that with the council's BI team, and they are still at that level in terms of the overall proportion. They're still confident that can be relied upon to provide, you know, to be statistically significant, if I can say that word, and that it is, you know, representative of residents of Leicestershire.
Mr. Poland.
Thank you. Yeah, just a question of fact, really. Do we know, appreciate if we don't know at the moment, will we know where people are writing from in terms of withdrawal from a certain organisation or from a certain geographical part of the county, or whether it's likely to be an even spread? Because obviously if we've got that, you know, a few hundred people writing in and they're all from SEN or something, do you know what I mean? It might sort of skew it.
James, half of them work for us.
So
you've only got 225 to think about.
Yeah.
You probably know them all.
I mean, we do find with these sort of things, if people are really annoyed and really don't like what you do, that's when you get a lot of people replying. So in some ways, I know it's not a particularly scientific answer, but I think if we were really kind of completely sort of off the mark with where our budget is, I think we would get a flood of people coming in. And it's probably one other point. We do every sort of about 4 years, we do a much bigger exercise where we get more like the 6,000-7,000 level of sort of responses. So that is a sort of in some ways, we use these annual budget ones almost as tests between those sort of periods to make sure it's still broadly where we are. But we do a much bigger exercise, which actually does cost us money, which is why we only get sort of a low response on these as well, because it's just internal resource.
We've had thousands write in about the tips, not only about the hundreds of millions of deficit we've got lying around.
Thank you to everyone who participated in that item, which moves on to item 9, which is the medium-term financial strategy 2024, 25, 27, 28 Chief Executives Department, which Lauren Haslam, the Director of Law and Governance, will introduce the report. We've also got Tom Purnell, the Assistant Chief Executive, Gary Connors, Head of Regulatory Services, and Sam Barrett, Finance Business Partner. The Chief Executive, John Sinnott, is also joining online. Along with the leader, we're also joined by Mrs. Taylor, lead member for Regulatory Services, and Mrs. Posnett, the lead member for Community and Staff Relations. And we've apologies for Mr. Payne, lead member for Waste and Minerals. Again, we'll go through the report stages in line with the circulated schedule. I might just wait for people to sit down. Lauren, are we handing over to you for this site?
Thank you. Good morning, members. So I'll take you through the report in 4 stages, I think, just as outlined in your agenda. So starting off, the first part of the report sets out the background with which members will be familiar. We've put in a little detail at paragraph 5 about the services provided by the Chief Exec's Department. As you'll see, it's a mixture of direct services to our communities, for example, in the planning and historic and natural environment area, and in regulatory services, including trading standards and the registration function. And secondly, support services, for example, legal, democratic services, and the strategy and BI team. It's relevant to note that some of these services are demand-driven, and the volume and complexity of the work is outside of our control. But I would say they're key to delivering change for the council, thinking about the governance around decision-making, legal issues on lawfulness of decision-making, the evidence base to support decisions from the strategy and BI team, and the equalities issues which affect our decision-making as well. Also to note the resilience function, which I think recent events have highlighted the importance of this area of work, which are an area of our business that is fairly key. Paragraph 7 sets out the summary of the revenue budget and growth and savings, which we'll come on to later in the report, and table 2 shows how this is split across our department. Moving on to paragraph 11, that refers to the budget transfer and the overspend on the coroner's costs arising as a result of the increase in the cost of the UHL on the coroner's related work. Members will be aware there's an ongoing discussion with the Ministry of Justice in relation to the coroner's service and the desire that we have as a council to maintain our own jurisdiction following the retirement of our coroner. And we're expecting and hoping that that will be resolved shortly. So I'll pause at that point. That's the end of the first part of the presentation on this paper, and invite any questions that you may have, members.
Mr. Richardson.
Thank you, Chair. I'm going to admit my total ignorance. The biggest cost in this department is strategy and business intelligence. I've got no idea, in fact, what they do, how many people do it, why we do it. But I do notice there's no savings identified in it. So presumably everything we do there must be vital. I mean, is it possible to give us a quick snapshot of what we do and why we've got no savings identified in that area?
Yes. Just a very brief summary. So the services that are provided within that area include the Business Intelligence Service, which does all of the sort of analytical work and data analysis, performance reporting, including supporting statutory performance reporting for the council. And obviously having good data and evidence and information drives good decision making. So that's a really key area of work. There is a data strategy work stream underway, which is jointly led by BI and IT, working with the transformation unit. So that will look at how that work is done. And so that's one of the corporate review areas, if you like. There's also an area, communities, policy and resilience. So there's a communities team that works with local communities, the voluntary sector, around supporting communities to help themselves, for example. There's also a sort of a small policy team that leads on the coordinating the development of the council strategic plan, and also the council's sort of equalities and diversity work. And then, as Lauren mentioned, there's the resilience service. So and that's jointly funded by all of the local authorities and the local resilience forum part of it, also by the Blue Light Services and other partners. And then the fourth area is the growth service, which includes an economic development team. So we work closely with the LEP and other partners around securing funding for the area, supporting economic development initiatives, and also sort of managing the implications of growth for the council and for the area as well. And again, that's another area where there is something called the growth programme, which again is one of the corporate reviews. The new interim head of service who's just been appointed is sort of picking up that piece of work, and we'll be looking at how that can be most effectively delivered in the future, and that could well be refocused in the light of new financial challenges. So that's a very brief summary of the area.
I suppose my question would there be is, do we need to do everything? So as a council, we have no statutory responsibility for economic growth because that sits with the districts, always has done. I appreciate we will shortly be taking on the responsibilities of the Leicester and Leicestershire Enterprise Partnership as part of the demise of that and moving forward. But on the basis of what we heard earlier about the fact we've got no money to spend on infrastructure and other such things, is that something at this time we generally need to spend? I mean, I appreciate when it was originally set up, I think the budget was $500,000. It's probably considerably above that. So what do we get out of that team for the money we spent? So what are the success stories and how much have they earned us and Leicestershire in their time in place?
I mean, I wouldn't be able to put a figure on that. So, and if that's something we could bring back at another time. Certainly, if I sort of look at that in two parts, there's sort of, we've had a long-standing economic development team that has worked with the LEP and others to secure funding for the area and has helped deliver some key projects. The Work and Skills Leicestershire project is an example of that, and we also work with the LEP to deliver the business support that is delivered across the area. Within the team, all of the council's broadband support work is done. So we manage the Super Fast Leicestershire programme, and we're now working with BD UK and Openreach and others to deliver the GigaHub projects. So there's a key area of work there. So I think that's a range of work that looks to deliver economic benefit to the area, supporting the council's stronger economy priority in the strategic plan. On the growth service side, that's more specifically around better coordinating the council's engagement with the growth agenda, including with district councils and local plans and large-scale developments. So it's making sure really that that the work that is done in highways, in education, around school places, around broadband provision and other infrastructure, that's all joined up, and the council's financial risks relating to that growth are managed as effectively as possible, but also that we get the best outcomes from those areas of activity too.
If I just ask through you, Chair, if at some point we have some examples, I'd be grateful, because I've never actually seen in any document the value of the growth team in any way, shape or form. And I just think when money's tight, is it actually generating what we need for the investment in it?
Certainly do that. Obviously, work is being done as part of the growth programme to understand all of that so that we can make decisions about how the service moves forward in the future.
Thank you. Mr. King.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. So I think, following on from Mr. Richardson, I think, I would share some of his concerns. There's a lack of, things are a bit opaque, I think, as to exactly some of the outputs here. But equally, I think what I'd say is, if we're doing business intelligence, there's lots of other, government does, collects lots of data and information, puts it out on the internet free. So I'm just wondering if we're not in danger, are we actually duplicating effort that's actually being done elsewhere? And I'm not sure, I'm not clear about that. So I think so what I wanted to understand was how many people actually work in the Chief Executive's department. And actually in all the reports, it doesn't actually talk about headcount anywhere. We're talking about where we might want to increase the numbers of people, but what we don't have any sense of is what are the numbers of people who work in any particular total area like chiefs or public health or whatever it is. So it's very hard to understand in terms of savings, because obviously the majority of our savings will come from people if we're going to make them by dropping the number of people that we employ. That's just the reality of the situation. So I'm a little unclear, what the total number of people are that the county council employs, because I've heard different figures that have been mentioned previously to me, and secondly, in all the different kind of directorates, what's actually happening and what's the direction of travel, or is it going down, is it going up, staying the same? Because ultimately, whilst you can stop doing certain things, it's going to come down to headcount, and I'm not very clear whether we're actually talking about reducing headcount, and I think that's really, really important. So I think I'd agree with Mr. Richardson. I think it would help if there were some examples. And just going back to what was raised in the previous session about growth agenda, I think we do need to understand, what's been done to learn from the previous situations that occurred with districts where there was massive disagreements about the growth agenda, so that going forward we don't get stuck in the he said, she said scenario, or we'll do this, you do that, and we needs to be much more joint working together. If we're not going to get that, then I'm not really sure how we're going to get growth and deliver infrastructure at pace. No, that was it really. Thank you, Chair. Thank you.
Yeah, well, we can provide the details of FTE for the department. It's around 250, excluding the registrar's 0-hour contract people, but I couldn't tell you precisely the amount, and obviously it varies sort of week on week as people come and go.
No more questions if we move on to the next.
So the next part of the paper is on the growth, and we've identified 3 areas of growth in the department. I'll touch on the first one, which is trading standards, and we're talking about growth of 3 FTE trading standards officers. It's obviously a very important area of our business. It's really to address new burdens on the services and delivered by that part of the business. To give you an example, the council recently received a letter from the Food Standards Agency sent to all local authorities, setting out their concerns about the adequacy of funding for food safety inspections, and reminding us of the duties that we have and the need to adequately resource that area of business. Also, members will be aware of the heightened interest in vapes, sales of vapes to underage children, and an announcement just today around a proposal to ban the sale of disposable vapes. Again, that's an area of work that we expect will come into the Trading Standards Department, and we need to make sure we have appropriate and adequate resource to deliver that function. Obviously, it's a safety issue, it's a public health issue, and it's really important that we're, from a reputational perspective, that we are able to adequately service that part of the business. I'll move on then to legal services. There are 2 areas of growth here. First, in the property and environment side, we're looking at engaging a solicitor to support the education sufficiency work programme, and the second one is to undertake work in connection with developer agreements. Obviously, that's important to make sure the council brings in the resource under Section 106 agreements and so on, all underpinned by legal agreements. And the third area is in the adult social care world. You'll see in the report at paragraph 9 the data in relation to the increase in that area of work, primarily in quarter protection cases. Over the last couple of years, it's gone up significantly. The alternative for legal services is to externalise the work to private practice solicitors. Unfortunately, that comes at a high cost, and it's far more cost effective for the council to engage in-house solicitors, culturally as well. In-house solicitors know how this council functions. They know what our objectives are. They understand how our client departments work, and they are able to meet those needs in a way that the private sector, although they're able to deliver the strict legal part of the work, they don't offer the extra support that an in-house legal team can offer. So that's the summary really of the growth proposals, and I'll pause there. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Lauren. Mr. Frisbee.
Thank you, Chair. Just coming from the rural capital of food, as I do, just going back to the issue around food, I was always of the opinion that it was environmental health that took over the auspices of food, hygiene and health, not trading standards. Could you just give me some clarity over that? Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Yes, I can provide that clarity on that. Food hygiene is a matter for environmental health at district council level. Food standards is a matter for trading standards. So the types of things that trading standards would deal with is, for example, adulteration of allergens where there's a risk to life. So we do work in partnership with environmental health. Every food business requires registration. We have to process that from a food standards perspective, but there is a crossover of work, but they are distinct, separate areas.
Thank you, Gary. Thank you, Chair.
Mrs. Page.
No, thank you, because Gary just answered it. I was going to say I'm a great fan of trading standards, and I know they're doing fantastic work. And I was only going to ask how much work do you do with the districts to ensure that you are dovetailing your work to use resources effectively. So you did say you're working with environmental health, but if you can elaborate, greatly appreciate it.
So in particular, in relation to food registration, the process, the triage process, in order to get that registration, will go through the district councils to us. We have regular meetings with the district environmental health officers to ensure that if we are doing any targeted inspection work, I'll give you an example, is probably the best. If we were looking at, say, allergen declarations on menus or labelling, at takeaways, for example, we would team up with environmental health to ensure that if a business is to receive an inspection from two agencies, it's better that that's coordinated. So we are regularly in touch with the district council's environmental health officers. They do vary in terms of what their priorities are as a district council. But we do work closely with them, and that also applies to other partners as well, not just food. So if we're looking at doorstep crime, for example, fraud committed at the doorstep with rogue traders, we liaise with the police. HMRC with illicit tobacco and vapes. We work with HMRC at East Midlands Airport for product safety. We work with the UK Border Force. So there's quite an enforcement community there, and better regulation is about that there is a requirement on us to coordinate any enforcement, particularly with businesses across the various agencies.
Thank you very much. And with the government announcement, which I really welcome because I've seen so many children in playgrounds vaping, will that put another strain on your resources and on the funding which you need?
Yes, it will. The announcement this morning would indicate there's around 30 million for enforcement across the different agencies. We think that's 5 million to trading standards across the country. Last week we were informed that we are to receive a £75,000 funding to carry out work at East Midlands Airport, because we already have a team out there currently funded externally on that. It's fair to say the funding will be welcomed, but it will come with that expectations with what
we already have a situation in which we really haven't got sufficient staff to cover all the areas, and we have to triage everything that comes in and look at it from a risk point of view.
Thank you, Chair. Just a very quick one. I appreciate we hope it's going to be self-financing, but should there not actually be a line in here about the LEP, about taking in the services with the budget? Because I appreciate it will probably come under the accountable body, which is the city, but obviously we will presumably be passporting some of the money which will come to us to that accountable body. So should it not form part of these accounts, or is it just off balance sheet? I don't know.
I mean, the council doesn't currently make a financial contribution to the LEP, and the proposals for the arrangements from April don't involve the county council putting any money into the LEP. So it's certainly for the next couple of years, it's funded by government grant and using existing LEP reserves that are in place.
Yeah, I appreciate that, but shouldn't it come in and out as a contra? Because we'd sure have to show it through the balance sheet somewhere, wouldn't we? Or do we just show it through the accountable body as the city?
Certainly, previously it's been done in that latter way through the accountable bodies of the city, so no financial implications for us in that sense.
Poland.
Thank you, Chair. Looking at the proposals for 2 extra solicitors for adult social care, the number of court protection cases seems to have gone through the roof, and I'm sure there's a story there, but probably not for the us here today. One of the things I in former life used to be lead member for legal at Charnwood, and I know we struggled to get solicitors sometimes because the money was less, although the lifestyle was better. Is recruitment a problem here? That's the first question, and the second one sort of linked to that is the difference in cost between a £70,000 solicitor in-house versus 170 outsourced is obviously massively significant. Are there any areas that we currently routinely use outsourced solicitors for? And if so, is there any potential to sort of recruit even further to bring those in-house if we're looking at savings of £100,000?
Thank you. Fiona might want to supplement my response to this question, but you're right in identifying recruitment as an issue for legal services. We have had a number of posts that we've advertised and had to re-advertise a number of times. We do apply the corporate recruitment incentive programme, which allows us to enhance the salary to a certain extent to try and overcome that problem, and that has been successful on occasions. In terms of outsourcing work, that tends to happen when we do have a gap in recruitment. So if a member of staff leaves, typically they have to give 3 months notice. We immediately start the recruitment exercise. If we're able to appoint, that person in turn will have to give 3 months notice. You always have a little bit of a gap. That sort of gap is managed either ways by engaging a locum solicitor, which is very costly, or externalising the work, because you can't have a case that's in litigation just unmanned, if you like, for any, even days, let alone weeks. But the routine externalisation of cases doesn't happen anymore. We had recently in legal services in the childcare area of the business, which is we've got 2 teams, quite big teams. We had a programme of work with our colleagues in the transformation unit, and one of the objectives of that was to look at how we could reduce the external spend on external solicitors, but also on counsel. So to try and bring our advocacy back in-house where we could. And that was a successful piece of work, and we managed to reduce the external spend considerably by engaging actually another solicitor, and it just took up that slack really that we were having to send out. All I can say is that we absolutely loathe sending work out. I mean, it just goes against the grain in all cases. It's just to be avoided at all costs, but there are occasions when you just have to have that flexibility to do so. Thank you.
Not sure I've got a huge amount to add to what Lauren said. She's covered it very thoroughly. But yes, recruitment is a huge issue, particularly in some teams, childcare and adult social care in particular. We've tried to recruit in our childcare teams for a number of posts over the last 18 months, I think, and we've had to go out to repeat advertising. And we're trying to reduce the locum spend as much as possible. You'll see for the two posts that are in educational sufficiency and the highways work, those are both replacing locums, which are obviously more expensive, so it makes sense to replace them with substantive posts. There's just one post we're looking for the adult social care team, and again, this is a really difficult area to recruit to, but as you see, the case levels there have gone up so much that the workload are becoming unmanageable. Our team leader in this area is leaving the council after 15 years this week because of workloads. So that's the pure growth. But the other one, the highways development agreements, we're hoping will be cost neutral after the first year, because that will be regained from the cost of the legal agreements that we'll charge to developers. And the educational sufficiency work is replacing somebody who'd been a locum for the last 10 years in this area. So it makes more sense to replace locums, and that it'll save us money in the long run. Hope that answers all your questions.
Mrs. Hack.
My question was on exactly the same vein, but it's about the 140 uplift and the 70 uplift. If that is there a saving then that we're seeing in a corresponding locum spend? Is that what we would expect? So is that net of that locum saving? And the second question, which Fiona's actually just answered, which was about the developer, are we going to get some income back off that work as those development agreements go through?
Yes, it is intended that will be to replace, as Fiona said, locums that we're using at the moment.
Mr. Frisbee.
Chair, forgive me if we've moved on. It's just going back to the today's announcement, and I concur with my colleague, Councillor Page, about it's good news that we are seeing the disposal of vapes. Can I just clarify, you spoke about £5 million going to trade. Is that across the board, Gary, or... So is that to actually tidy up the mess that was, the mess that is, or the mess that we're about to face? Because £5 million wouldn't even cover the parking for trading standards, would it?
That's 5 million. That's according to the announcement on the .gov site today. It talks about £30 million for enforcement spread across HMRC, trading standards, and UK Border Force. The Association of Chief Trading Standards Officers that have been in consultation with the government over this, the indication is that 5 million is going to come across the UK for enforcement. But the reality of how that drops into Leicestershire County Council, we're not entirely sure. We do have some of it already, as I've said, on the airport, that's come in. But I mean, at the minute, we just don't have sufficient information yet. But clearly, Mr. Sunak the Prime Minister wants to push this through fairly quickly, because the consultation period has been relatively short. So we're hoping to see some of that money, which, from the county's perspective, the airport's separate funding. We will put, the concern will be is the moment the ban is introduced, it will drive disposable vapes as a cheap form of access to children. It'll drive it underground temporarily. So it's as important that we do the work at the port of entry as well. But we shall see.
Thank you, Gary. Thank you, Chair.
Mr. King.
Yep, thank you, Chair. A couple of queries. So first off, does this, is the Inward Investment Agency, which we covered at a previous scrutiny meeting, is this covered in this budget section? The I believe it was 600,000, if memory serves me right, that we contribute towards that. And also, I saw last week that the government has announced the implementation of the BNG regs, I believe, to start in, well, fairly immediately for major developments, and then to start, I believe, in April. And that's on page 69. It says no savings identified. I'm not imagining there's any savings, but there's probably going to be a cost that we haven't factored in, or have we factored it in and we were just waiting for the government to finalise the announcement. But if we haven't factored the cost in, are we going to now have to put in a line somewhere for this service? I understand county is the lead authority and the districts are all going to make a contribution. So am I right in thinking that then it will be a cost neutral expenditure? I'm grateful if you clarify that. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. I can take both of those. The council's contribution to the place marketing team, which carries out inward investment and tourism support work for Leicester and Leicestershire, is covered in the strategy and business intelligence line in table 2. And I think you mentioned 600,000, but we make a cash contribution of about 60,000 and second 2 members of staff. So that's where that's covered. And then on biodiversity net gain, we're currently working through the implications of the guidance and putting in place an advisory service that will be used by the district councils. The costs of that still need to be worked out, but obviously the costs will be shared across the various partners. We're not anticipating that to be additional cost to the council. There may potentially be a saving, but as I said, there is that all needs to be worked through.
Thank you.
Right, Lauren.
Just to add on to the final point, you'll see on page 69, it's one of the savings under development, I think, Councillor King, that you've identified. It's an area where we're hoping we'll be able to generate income rather than spend money, if you see what I mean.
No, that's my understanding. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Chair. I wasn't going to mention it because I've forgotten all about it. Place marketing, favourite one. We questioned them extensively at the last scrutiny committee, and there were actually no examples at all where they've been successful in actually attracting inward investment. So I'll just urge that we do have a look at that service, because it doesn't actually seem to be achieving anything, and we seem to be paying them for something that doesn't seem to happen.
Solely the head of place marketing, who was at that meeting, has taken away that as an action. I think he just didn't have that information at his fingertips, but it is planning to pull something together on that. No.
Sorry, I thought I'd pressed that. Sorry, apologies. The next part of the paper focuses on savings. So we've got 8 listed. They're all rated as green. The first 3 are carried forward from the last MTFS, and CE 4 to 8 are new. I think I'm hoping that what's contained against them is sufficient information, but I'm happy to take any questions, but only simply to note as well that we're applying the level 2 extra financial controls, obviously, against these, as well as an additional sort of tightening the belt, so to speak. And the 3 listed as savings under development, income generation, process and service efficiencies. We're part of a rolling programme of reviews. Gary's area of the business has been undertaken. Democratic services is in the course of being reviewed at the moment, and I think we're moving on next to registration service. And the third area is the one we've just spoken about, biodiversity net gain. I think maybe if there's any questions on any of the savings, that would probably be the easiest way to deal with it, Chair.
Thank you, Lauren. Does anyone have any questions, comments on this part of the report? No? Okay, so back to you.
To finish off the last part of the paper, the external influences we've sort of touched on already. We're talking really about demand management and sort of income stream being slightly outside of our control, dependent on external central government guidance and statutory instruments. Some restrictions on what legal services can do. They're very ambitious in their targets around income generation, but there are restrictions on the bodies with whom legal services can trade from a regulatory perspective. And then just the Levelling Up and Regeneration Act, which has been implemented recently. We heard about it in the paper, the one that preceded this, the discussions around devolution, for example. If that does develop into something that will be a significant area of work across our department, as you might expect. a little section at paragraph 8 on other funding sources and grants, and then just the capital programme. There's only one area, capital, referred to. That's for a legal services case management system, which is a potential investment for us in order to enable us to really try and produce accurate management data on case numbers, how long cases take to progress, that sort of thing. We have got a case management system. It's very old. It's really, we're just looking at that at the moment to see whether it is fit for purpose or whether it needs to be upgraded. So I think I'm sort of optimistic that we might not have to do that, and we'll upgrade what we've got and make do. But I think it just needs to stay on there for the time being while we work through the sort of analysis that we need to do on that. Thank you, Chair. I don't have anything else to add.
Thank you, Lauren. Anyone, any other comments, questions? Does anyone else in the room or online have any comments, questions on this item before we conclude it? No. Okay. Thank you, everybody, for presenting.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lauren, and thank you, Gary. Right. We move on to item 10, which is the medium-term financial strategy 2024-25 to 27-28, the Corporate Resources Department. Declan Keegan is back for this item to introduce the item, supported by Assistant Directors Simone Hines, who's back again, and Gordon McFarlane and Jane Glasgow are joining us as well. Mr. Brecken continues to be with us, and Mr. Bushton as well. So if I hand over to you, Declan, to take this item.
Sorry, shuffling around. So I'll just give a really brief intro. I think most of you know what corporate resources sort of is and does, but obviously we're a bit of an eclectic mix of sort of back office, frontline services, and also trading services. And that requires the department to kind of, I suppose, a little bit kind of sort of splitting its sort of focus. Part of it is just sort of trying to, that focus on running our own services efficiently and effectively, but also trying to sort of support the other departments with their services as well. And obviously kind of, we're not insulated from the external pressures that sort of the authorities facing as a whole, and traded services in particular have seen that coming through. And that's a big focus on the department's improvement activity at the moment. It's just sort of make sure we can kind of get those traded services where they need to be. But whilst we've got that sort of significant effort as well supporting other departments, it is, it's really pleasing sort of, the first section of the report on growth that the team sort of that run the sort of the department have managed to sort of suppress all those kind of pressures and find mitigating actions. So happy to take any question on the first part of the report.
Does anyone have any comments, questions on part 1, paragraphs 1 to 13, appendix A? No. Okay, so back for the next part of the report.
So the savings for the department set out on paragraph 15, and I think you'd be familiar with most of these, if not the sort of the specific line, the actual sort of the area that we're touching on. We have been sort of obviously sort of in the theme of kind of the pressures authorities under, still looking for sort of further savings. By the time the cabinet report gets issued, we expect to add another £300,000 to £400,000 to that total. The increase, about half of the increase will come from sort of the continued reduction in property running costs, and the other elements we sort of similar sort of back office things. There's nothing kind of frontline or contentious in there. Touched on traded services a second ago. Despite that getting a lot of focus at the moment, we haven't put any sort of savings in there, just because we're not where the sort of traded services need to be. So before we sort of consider savings, we've got to sort of recover that base position as it were. The report also goes on to cover the cross-cutting initiatives, from paragraph sort of 30, and the aim there is to provide savings over and above what's already in the MTFS, and that could be across the authority, not necessarily just sort of corporate resources. So there's an awful lot of focus on that for next year to start to generate initiatives that will close that financial gap as a whole. Happy to take any questions on the savings section.
Mr. Richardson.
Thank you, Chair. I don't know where to ask the traded services ones here in or in 13, but I might do it in several places. So if I can start at ways of working, and couple that with review of mobile phones tariff. So ways of working, it says here we're receiving income of 780,000 a year from 25-26, which seems a bit strange that we're only getting 70,000 for 24-25, which slightly worries me. But it says later on in the report that we're actually investing 5.4 million over the MTFS period in ways of working. So what we're actually saying is we're investing 5.4 million. We're making income of 4 million at best. So why are we doing it? What is the actual saving we're generating? Now, if you then link that to the mobile telephones, I assume that during COVID, the cost of the use of mobile telephones quite understandably went up, considering people working from home, etc. And we now seem to have a significant number of people working from home. So what was the budget for mobile phones at the start of COVID? What is it now? So is that a 90,000 saving on an elevated figure, or is it 90,000 saving on pre-COVID? So I'm not quite sure of ways of working, because also you've then got the lost opportunity costs. So were we not to have rented the place out, consolidated our staff onto a smaller platform, sold off part of the campus, even if we just invested that money, that would be bringing in probably the best part of £500,000 a year. So we've also lost an opportunity cost of £500,000 a year. So I'm not quite sure these are savings when we're spending more than we're saving. And also my favourite question I was deferred about, if we truly are saving money, and it may be we have a legal duty to do it, but I'm sure our residents will be somewhat puzzled as to why we're spending money on paying union employee reps' salaries, as I understand it, providing them free office space, when such things should surely be provided out of members' subs rather than residents' hard-earned council tax.
I think we'll split this. I'll pick up the first bit around broader ways of working, then and trade unions as well, and then Jane can come in around mobiles and IT. I think I've got the exact figures in detail in front of me, but it's a mix of investment now. So what we're doing around refurbishing floors, and we've talked about those in other forums. We are increasing the income that we're getting from tenants. And we've got a significant target which we're getting close to achieving. So I think that the programme is a balance between short-term investment, long-term income, but the figures also include overall investment in IT, so the kit, not just mobile phones but laptops, etc. And Jane might be able to talk about where that fits, and that's probably why the figures feel a bit skewed. I think the other thing I was going to say was we're going to propose in February to have a private scrutiny session in April where we can go into ways of working in a bit more detail. We can also go into the commercials in a bit more detail, which is more difficult to do in an open meeting. So we're in a private session to do that. And I think you can see, that there are some other targets to go at. There are other opportunities to go at in terms of productivity, reduction in carbon, broad reduced operating costs, and then recruitment and retention. So there are other gains from doing this. How we use our people, our IT, and our property in a joined up way. So all of those are tools, if you like, rather than simply looking at property. Perhaps if I hand over to Jane, because there's a link with mobiles and IT kit, and then I'll come back to trade union point.
That's great. Thank you, Gordon. So in terms of laptops, network infrastructure and so forth around ways of working, we had originally intended pre-ways of working to spend about £3 million on the previous VDI solutions and the upgrades needed for that. So a big chunk of the cost that we're seeing in there is directly related to, instead of using the virtual desktop infrastructure we used before, moving to laptops and those infrastructure components for those to do. So there is an element of one being roughly the same as the other. So sort of 6 and 2 3s in terms of those costs, and those do show up in those numbers. In terms of the mobile phone contracts, we did a tender exercise, I believe about 3.5 or 4 years ago, and we actually reduced the cost from a revenue perspective of those lines at that point. On top of that, we were able to pool our data together into a single central repository in such a way that it meant that high volume users for data weren't paying extortionate amounts, and then people who weren't using it, we were losing that data. So we moved to a much more flexible tariff then. So from a revenue perspective, that reduced at that point. And then the reduction that you're seeing in this document is a further reduction on that. Now, where it has increased is in terms of those handset costs, because we were at about 2,300 devices 4 years ago. We're currently just over 3,000, as you've seen from this, and there is work underway to actively reduce that. What we have seen is a change in how certain teams are working, especially around social care, very much so in children's, where they're engaging with the service users, et cetera, in a very, very different way, and having to use tools such as WhatsApp, et cetera, in order to engage with them, which unfortunately does require a mobile. But we are challenging those. That process is underway. We have been successful in reducing the number of phones to the tune of a couple hundred so far, which there's still further work to be done. But we also have managed in this contract renegotiation to remove the floor. So there was a minimum level of devices we had to have in the previous contract, and we no longer have to do that. So we won't be penalized if we do manage to reduce those number of devices significantly.
So coming on to that, so what were we spending on mobile phones last year, the year before, this year, compared to what we will spend? When we look at, as you say, developing the offices, I mean, I've walked around some of the new offices, and you go up there and every desk has got 2 screens on it. Every user says we don't need 2 screens. Why have we got 2 screens? A lot of screens would be revenue expenditure, because presumably we write them off in a year rather than over several years, because they cost under £1,000. So I assume there's not a capital cost. Is this a net cost of ways of working, or are we showing the MRP cost taken off of there to reduce the savings? So I'm never quite sure what ways of working is trying to achieve. If it was trying to achieve savings, it doesn't appear to have done it at a time when we desperately need to. And it would be really nice to see a business case for ways of working, to see some balance sheets and work out where we are, because all I can see is that we seem to be generating income far less than we're spending at a time when we need every bit of income we can. And there's nothing in this report that actually tells me holistically what ways of working looks like. And did we review the business case before we started renting out all this space? Because, as I said, no one's answered the opportunity cost of what else we could have done on this campus, which probably would have given us more long-term income than what we're actually generating by renting the place out.
So in terms of the savings piece, one bit I'll just flag is that the MTFS by its nature just looks at the change compared to last year. So the 70,000 is just the extra rental. If you look back at the current year's MTFS, there's another 600,000 there. So the overall savings for ways of working is the 1.4 million, just to give it that context, because in fairness, I do appreciate it only says the incremental in there. So the prize is the 1.4 million. Because we knew the session was coming up in April to sort of go into ways of working a bit more, we've gone sort of quite light here, but we can get into that sort of full business case aspect of things. So you can get you're absolutely right, there's a trade-off of, what's the capital value of the site, compared to kind of actually sort of like moving the disruption, sort of going somewhere else. So you can get into that a bit more in that session.
Mr. King. Oh, thank you back again, Mr. Easton.
Yeah, just come back in around trade unions. So trade unions have got a statutory right to reasonable paid time off to carry out trade union duties. So that sits in the legislation. Then what authorities will do is negotiate facilities agreements, something that's reasonable in terms of recognised trade unions, the size of the authority, etc., for the purposes of consultation, negotiation, collective bargaining, just generally good employee relations. So we've got 3 recognised trade unions, Unison, Unite and GMB, and we've got just over 4 full-time equivalent officials. The annual cost is around about 160, 170,000 to fund those, and we give them reasonable facilities in terms of a room. So there's an opportunity cost to providing that room, photocopying facilities, etc. I think that's something that we negotiated a number of years ago. If we look at the amount of change, transformation, casework, etc., that we have, my professional view is that's a reasonable position for us to land at, and I certainly wouldn't seek to reduce it at this point. If we look at what we're facing, over the life of the next MTFS, for example, and the need for good employee relations during the time that we're making further changes.
I mean, as long as it's legal, it just strikes me as strange that we're paying union reps. Because otherwise, why do they pay subscriptions? Why do staff members pay subscriptions for their union rep? I'm not aware of other councils that have union reps in the office and where we pay their salary. So is it a common thing across councils, or are we an outlier? But I just find it difficult to understand how, I'm a council taxpayer. I'm thinking, well, why am I paying a union rep out of my council tax? It just strikes me as somewhat absurd, to say the least.
It is a common position. As I say, the facilities agreements will vary for each council. They're locally negotiated. Certainly everywhere I've worked, we've had paid trade union reps, and they're paid as part of, the facilities agreement. And in terms of trade union subs, they will go towards kind of national, regional infrastructure, local marketing budgets, etc. So there'll be a whole range of things that they'll use the subs for. But that's not something I can answer in any more detail.
Mr. King.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Just on that last point, actually, I thought the government had brought in legislation that enables public sector employers to actually do exactly what Mr. Richardson has said, and that's actually not pay, subsidise trade union activities for public sector employers. And I'm a bit surprised that we're still doing that. I, as a taxpayer, I don't know what, why are we funding? I can't understand why we're doing that, but so I think it's something that needs. I would suggest to Cabinet they might want to look at. So just talking about the savings, and I've got a bit of a query here about the savings table under paragraph 15. So looking at 24-25, presumably the savings that are written down there are savings against 23-24. Yeah, that's correct.
Yeah, so it's a change to the 23-24 budget.
Yeah,
okay.
Right. So then the savings for 25-26, are they also for 23-24, or are they savings on 24-25?
They're against that same baseline budget, so against the 23-24 budget.
So they're not additional savings, it's just you've written them along, they're basically savings on 23-24, they're not savings on 24-25, and 26-27 isn't savings on 25-26.
So they're additional savings, but it's only the incremental amount. So compared to 23-24, our cost base will be about £1 million lower than the current year.
But once we've banked,
and then the year after, you'll take off another 1.6 million. So it's not the cash position; it is moving the income or the expenditure lines. So by the end of the MTFS, you'll be spending 3 million less on corporate resources than you were before.
So it's not cumulative position. So 1 plus 2.5 and 3 and 3, that's a lot more than 3. You see what I'm saying?
So if you add them up, it'll be the cash saved. But at the moment, this is the overall impacts on either the income or the expenditure line.
Right. Okay. Not quite sure I get that, but what I was going to say is what I said before. I think it would be really helpful if we had an understanding of how many employees we're keeping alongside this and how many are going. But I do think the savings that are being proposed are very marginal at best. Quite a lot of these. I don't think. I think it just looks like an exercise in salami slicing to me, because there are marginally 50k here, 15k there, 70k there. On the scale of the budget that's involved, these are very marginal savings at best. And I don't think. I think the expression I was going to. I mean, apart from the ICT efficiencies, but what you've just explained there is it's not a cumulative saving. It's comparing the saving and then saying, well, actually that saving applies every year. Well, yeah, but in my mind, the savings 1 year, you've saved next year. You don't keep on saving that money. Your baseline has dropped. So in reality, you've got a new baseline. So I know this is the counting presentation, but I just don't think enough is being done here. And looking at the Appendix A, a lot of the expenditure lines are discretionary or a mixture of discretionary and statutory. And I'm just wondering, why we're not doing more to address some of the, sadly, it's the reality, why we're not doing more to address the discretionary services area and actually look at, if I look at the commercialisation, that's costing us, quite a lot of money. So that's not really bringing us the revenue that one would expect. That's the traded services area predominantly, isn't it? But what I wanted to understand is, what is LTS infrastructure in Appendix A? What does that refer to? Because that seems to be quite successful and brings in quite a lot of revenue. I'm just wondering what that line was.
Just going back to the comment about sort of level of saves, corporate resource net budget is only slightly over £30 million. So you're looking at getting on for 10%. So it is a significant change. And as I've said, we'll continue to look for further savings. Then just to put it and try again on the sort of the explanation of the table, that £1 million of ICT efficiencies means that by 2027-28 and ongoing, the IT service will spend £1 million less than it does at the moment. So it's not just a one-off cash saving. That's a sort of a permanent reduction in their budget. So if their starting budget was £10 million, it will reduce to £9 million, and that's what the budget will be ongoing then. So it's a real genuine sort of saving, a real reduction.
Yeah, no, I get that bit, but it's not then a saving from. So what I'm getting at is that if it reduces, if I can tackle this next year, the following year, it's not another £1 million saving on 24-25. It's compared to 23-24, not a million on a million on a million, which is, if I hadn't asked, I would have misinterpreted your table.
And no, because obviously we were taking £1 million off the budget, we wouldn't have any IT in 10 years. So.
A bit problematic, wouldn't it?
A little bit, yeah. In terms of the scale, in terms of the FTE, it's about 1,400 sort of people working in the corporate resources department. The rump of that is within the sort of commercial area with sort of the school food service. And if Jane wants to go into sort of detail on the LTS infrastructure, that's in terms of why that's a negative, which is sort of a slightly odd way around. The overall commercialism, you're right. It's an area of focus at the moment. It's only just got its head above water in terms of an overall contribution of sort of just shy of £250,000, which is why it is a focus at the moment. But I'll let Jane touch on the kind of the ins and outs of the infrastructure line.
Well, we do have a dedicated section later on, agenda item for traded services, and Richard Hunt will be here, who will be able to explain everything in much more detail than I can. If we could maybe put the question in at that point.
Yeah, that's fine. Thank you.
Mrs. Hack.
I actually understanding the IT budgets and what I have to deal with at work, actually finding some savings, I think is something on top of the position that we've been saving for 13, 14 years. We're now getting to the very last bit of what's left. I'm interested in what we anticipate long term, and maybe that's something that will appear in this private session, which will be about the transition between capitalising IT and actually switching over to monthly costs in terms of you don't buy licenses anymore, you actually buy monthly licenses, and how that will change from a capital to a revenue. But I suppose the other element on top of that is then about security and safety, and how that will change over time. And certainly that is what keeps my work IT manager awake at night, is the IT security elements. And I know there has been some hacking incidents across the local government sector. So my interest maybe will come in this private session, but it's about how the transition between capital and revenue might end over time.
You're absolutely right. The models for IT are changing. They're very much moving to a revenue model. More and more of our infrastructure is hosted off-site with third-party providers, but security is a significant focus, and we are shifting and have shifted a significant amount of our spend onto security. Again, we can talk about that another time.
Mr. Frisbee.
Thank you, Chair. I apologise. I'm doing that thing of going back to something that I think we've moved on from, but it's picking up from my colleague, Councillor Richardson, in respect of union reps. Am I right, Gordon, that you said it's £160,000 that we as council taxpayers are paying for 4 reps? I'd just like to ask, is there sufficient demand to have 4 reps? In other organisations I've worked with, I've supported the union and I was expected to take that as an additional remit duty. Do they do that exclusively? They're just employed as union reps, or is this an addition to something else they're expected to field? Thank you, Chair. Thank you.
So I think the broad point is we need to look at the size and complexity of the organisation. And certainly in my experience, the 4 reps are Unison. GMB has something like half a day a week, and Unite does not have any dedicated paid time. So it's channeled through Unison, and all 3 trade unions were comfortable with that. They're seconded from their roles into Unison, dedicated Unison roles, and then there will be local reps, in departments who do that in addition to their day jobs, but that's not funded separately.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Gordon. Mr. Richardson.
Thank you, Chair. I did want to come back at this point on traded services because I realise it's in Appendix A, but just on that final point, we talked about obviously going out to our residents for comments on the budget. So what line on the budget does the union reps appear under? Because when I first became a councillor, it used to have a separate line in the budget. Now, one assumes, if I was cynical, which of course I'm not, I'm sure it's pure accident, that it disappeared into a larger pot so that people didn't realise we were funding union reps. So why are we hiding these things? So, yeah, if I was a member of the public, I'd like to look at the council's balance sheet and say, right, we're paying 160,000 for union reps. I might be totally happy. But presumably we hide it so they can't do that. So how can they comment on it when we do a consultation? And I'll come back to the traded standards bit in a second.
I mean, it's not hidden. It's just a question of how many lines we'd have of 160,000 across the authority. So it's just purely a practicality. Gordon may know about it'll be almost certainly within the HR line, the human resources line. So when it's kind of, we do publish it. We have to, it's sort of part of the transparency code. It does get put on the website, which is another reason why we don't sort of add it to here, because it's sort of already covered somewhere else.
I won't comment further on that on our book on the website, but that's by the by. Coming back to traded services, I was trying to do a comparison to these figures from the interim report on traded services on agenda item 13, and I failed miserably. But if I've added up agenda item 13 correctly, and it's relevant to this agenda item, we are losing 1.344 million on traded services this year, and we're planning to lose 243,000 next year. And that takes no account of opportunity costs we're giving up by not sweating or using our assets effectively. So by any account, it's a disaster. The biggest item in there, which is a disaster, is obviously school meals, where we failed to do correct contracts with the users. So what have we done to ensure that we do not issue contracts of that nature which leave us so financially exposed? And has any action being taken against the people that have written contracts in this format, which have cost the council £4 million? I mean, I work for an organisation. If you lost £4 million by writing a contract incorrectly, you probably wouldn't be around anymore. But if we then look at Bow Manor, it says in the report at the bottom that we're losing 206,000 next year, whereas this is Appendix A. Whereas it says in this report that we're only losing 18,000 this year. So there's a major discrepancy. Now, I suspect this is because Bow Manor, as it says in the interim report, also includes below the line costs. So how are we to look at a budget when it doesn't show all of the costs if we've got the below the line costs elsewhere? So if we're truly supposed to be scrutinising this budget, we can't do it effectively just on limited figures which are actually appear to be distorting the financial situation. Now, again, I'll do it now, but it says in the bottom report, for instance, that we had a very successful Christmas fair at Bow Manor. Well, it was lovely. I went along, I'm pleased to say. And I got there on the Saturday, and it was lunchtime, and I was feeling a bit peckish. So I went to the catering bit and said, I'll have that, and that, to which I got, there's no hot food left. So clearly we have an inability to run these things because we couldn't even, I mean, we could have sold an extra 30,000 quid's worth of hot food that afternoon, but we didn't have it. So we had 6 staff standing there serving coffees and the odd cake. So are we really in a world where we can efficiently run services of this nature? Because the address seems to be beyond us. I mean, I've been arguing this case for the last 8 years. These services have never made money, never will make money. We keep on getting assurances every other year that we're turning it round, but the figures show differently. 1.344 million loss and a 243,000 loss next year as a minimum. If you add on to that a $250,000 opportunity cost income, it's costing us $500,000, probably 750,000 to run these services. Should we be running services at that loss, bearing in mind the number of people it actually serves?
I won't try and pick up all the points, but just as a fundamental kind of approach, it is right that the traded services, because it is pure, well, it's largely pure choice. I'll come across the sort of the wrinkle in a second, but we do aim to sort of make a contribution. You know, services like school food did used to previously make money. When COVID came along, we were caught in kind of, I suppose, that invidious situation of kind of, you can either try and push things onto schools which don't have the capacity, or we can kind of, you know, almost sort of try and sort of work with sort of the income bracket we've got. But when you've got things like national living wage and food costs going up at such a rate, you're only negotiating with the sort of schools on an annual basis. So you just, you know, we don't know what the pay award is in advance. So it just puts you on the back foot, it puts you behind. So there is a lot more kind of, a lot more focus on just sort of trying to get the cost base down to where it needs to be. Like I say, that is the main sort of focus of where the sort of the work of the sort of the department has been, is getting the sort of school food service in particular on an even keel. With all these services, that they are sort of dual kind of purpose. You know, primarily they are there for sort of the traded function. So I'm not trying to get away from the fact that they should be making a positive contribution. But none of these are an easy decision if you want to stop them. You know, the school food service, there are wider benefits there than just trying to sort of make money from it. Similarly, Bow Manor, the reason we sort of, you know, have tended to hold on to that is for the outdoor education piece. So with all of them, it's kind of, it's not as simple as just kind of the, you know, the sort of the black and white on the money side of things. It is very, very important, not trying to sort of get away from that fact. We'll just have to sort of bear in mind it's not easy to sort of dip in and out of these services. In terms of the presentation, we've been on this sort of before, and the reason we bring the sort of separate traded services together is to bring that rounded picture. Whenever we present the budget, it's always on a responsibility basis. If we could, you do see some authorities, and they go sort of overboard in terms of just allocating everything out. So there's no ownership at the corporate centre of the costs there. It's sort of owned for. So the main reason that Bow Manor costs are different is because of the maintenance budget. You know, the head of operational property is responsible for that maintenance budget, and that's where it kind of comes into the budget. When we present you the traded services picture, that is reallocated then, so you get that true picture. But it's just different sort of reports for different purposes. The only reason the presentation is different.
Mr. King.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. So just looking at the corporate resources capital, we're on capital.
No, we haven't quite got there yet.
Right. Well, what I was just going to. Okay, so I'll put my question when we've done that. Okay, thanks.
Right, Mrs. Page. No.
Yes, very short. I hear what you're saying in relations of having to make a contribution, but I have to repeat what I have said many times. We're a council that provides services, potholes, etc., and I'm never sure whether we need to make a contribution to a loss leader at the expense of our residents. And I may repeat that we are not developer and caterers. But my question is, and it's a very basic question, when you're looking at all of the cost, for instance, the way of working and the transformation unit, there's quite a considerable cost, but yet, you know, we're not sure what the benefits are. And I wonder, would it be prudent maybe to combine the two services? Because after all, transformation is a way of working. So what is the point that we are keeping two separate services at two considerable costs running alongside each other? And would it not be prudent to amalgamate that? Thank you.
Just to pick that up briefly, so Transformation Unit is a dedicated service that we've had since 2014, supporting major change across the council. So if you think about, and as you've seen from the whole of the MTFS, a whole range of really complex change initiatives that are facilitated by kind of project and program managers, change experts effectively. So that's a dedicated unit. I head up the Ways of Working programme. That's a time-limited programme that does have some transformation unit resource in it, but it's a cross-cutting programme like some of the other cross-cutting programmes we've referred to later on in this paper. So it's not a service that we would merge. It's a specific piece of work that we're progressing, and it happens to have some transformation unit resource in it.
So it couldn't be amalgamated under one heading and have some resource savings rather than running two different streams at two separate costs.
I'd say no, because the transformation unit is a back office service, if you like HR, finance, etc. So that's a specific service working right across the council on a range of programmes, including cross-cutting programmes like Ways of Working. So that's one work stream for it.
I don't know whether this helps, but it's Ways of Working is staffed by transformation people, so it's not how they've just sort of set up their own sort of independent little kind of island, as it were. And Ways of Working is just a time-limited programme, so at some point it will disappear, and you'll just be left with kind of, you know, other transformational sort of work.
Weston, did you want to come in?
Just briefly, Chairman, on the union question. Well, as you can imagine, I've never been a member of a union, but I think that the money we spend with the unions, in my view, represents good value. I'll ask Gordon to prepare me a little note on it after this meeting, but I've always sought to defend it. I mean, 160,000, okay, it sounds a lot, but our budget is what, 500, 600, whatever million, and it's useful, in my view, to have good working relations with the three unions. There are a few wrinkles in the system, which I'm getting a note of about from the chief soon. But in the absence of bad news or anything really untoward, I would be perfectly happy as a Conservative to be able to justify that to my electorate. That I think it is useful to have a channel to negotiate with, people you can sit down and talk to. And it's only what, 2.5 or something in man hours. And then there's other ones that do the job for free as part of their other job. But I've not been told of anything where I seek to make that saving. Although, having heard Terry's questions and Phil's, I'll get Gordon to do me a note. And if I think there's anything that requires change, I'll let you know. But personally, I think it represents good value with what we get, you know, in terms of the relationship and stuff and the channels of communication. I think it works.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Weston. Mrs. Hack, did you have your hand up? Sorry.
Just to put on record, I'm a member of the GMB union, maybe just for transparency, and I appreciate the clarity from Leader.
King, did you want to come back?
Just a query. Do we actually know how many employees of the County Council are members of the trade unions?
Technically, we're not supposed to have that information. That's kind of trade union information. I believe it's probably around 30%. Are in, sorry, yeah.
So Chair, thanks for that, Gordon. That's really appreciated. So I would kind of conclude, Leader, by saying I think it does need looking at, because, you know, 30%, 160,000 subsidy from the public purse, from local residents who are hard pushed. I think that's and I appreciate we have to fund some of it, but I'm just wondering whether we have to fund all of that.
I didn't know it was that low. It's the first time I've heard that, even guesstimate, because as Gordon says, we're not supposed to know it. But I think sometimes the people that aren't in unions do rely on the other ones that are in unions to do the negotiation. And unless I can see evidence to suggest that it's not worth the money, I would still let it be funded, because it is an avenue for us to have good relations with our staff. And I didn't know it was that low. That's the only thing I'll say to you, Phil. So Gordon will let me know when he does me a quick note, and if I think it's anything serious. But it'll have to be something serious to want to ditch it, because I don't really want to annoy every single person that works for us, because we are a people-based business. But I hear what you say. I'll look at it.
Thank you, Gordon. And then if we
just picking up really briefly that point around collective bargaining, that the 30% is still a significant number. But if we reach a collective agreement with trade unions, policy X, doesn't matter what it is, that then applies across the whole council to trade union and non-trade union members. So just the way the collective bargaining works. And I absolutely agree with the leader. We really value good employee relations. I've seen in other places, and you'll have seen headlines in other places where there's not good employee relations, and it causes chaos. So something that I really want to hang on to.
Yes, through you, Chairman, it has been raised, it has been noted, leaders looking into it. Can we please move on?
Yeah, Declan, did you want to sum up the final part of this?
Yes, the final section, just capital, and obviously kind of members will be able to see it's very much dominated by ICT, both in the specific line headed about ICT, but also if you sort of dig into the ways of working line as well, that's very sort of ICT dominated. And if you look at sort of both those lines, the theme across both of them is end of life replacement. So, we do look to expend the life of where it is ever sort of sensible to do so. So again, sort of the numbers, you may see them shift around as sort of go on time. We try and sort of eke a bit extra out of them, but like I say, it's only sort of only as things are sensible. So happy to take any questions on the capital section.
The King.
Yeah, thanks for that, Declan. So what we're proposing then over the MTFS is an investment of just under £10 million, got that right. But actually it's only going to generate a saving under the savings of 3.1 million. So we're actually investing 6, and we're actually only saving 3 on the MTFS, because, obviously. So what's concerning me, as I said earlier, I don't think we're driving down enough savings here in this particular. The gross expenditure is it's nearly 80 million a year. I appreciate there's a lot of revenue that comes in as well, but to me, my mind, that's just not enough being driven out of the costs. I appreciate you've already done a lot, but I think there's more that we can probably do, given what we've said about traded service. I mean, the county council public authority is not a good operator of cafes or tourist shops or whatever it is. In my experience, we should let the market pick those up, rent their units out, or get rid of them. In my mind, because we're not a good operator. We're not quick enough. We can't be, just the nature of the organisation, to react to consumer changes in tastes and all that sort of stuff. It's something that private sector does a lot better than what we can ever do, and I think we should recognise that and get out. Thank you.
Do you want to come back?
Just to clarify the comparison of that 10 million capital investment, the majority of it isn't spent to save, the majority of it is end of life type replacement. So if you take the biggest item on there, the backup system replacement in ICT, that's a pure kind of, old system replaced by kind of new system. So, and I suppose there's that point again, that £3 million on the saving is an ongoing that you'd save that money every year once you've made those savings. So it's 3 million of cash less you're spending every year, whereas the 10 million of capital is a one-off investment. But like I say, it's not quite a fair comparison, because most of the capital spend isn't for spend to save. It's just to keep the lights on, as it were, and keeping up with things like the backup is primarily around sort of cyber security. In terms of the point on trade, we may come on to it on the later paper, but in terms of that sentiment, I do agree that we should identify what we are good at and only sort of focus on those where that gives us some sort of advantage on the trade service. And in some ways, that's why we've kept the school food for so long, because it's a £15 million turnover business. So we are one of the bigger caterers in the county. But in the essence, your point is right. Identify what you're good at and focus on those. So I do agree with that.
Richardson, did you?
Thank you, Chair. In the interest of disparity, I will say I'm in my 51st year as a union member. So I'm a union member, have been for 51 years. I'm probably the longest union member in this room, probably, I suspect. But just a couple of interesting things on the capital one. And one has to ask these daft questions. So there's a little box at the bottom of the capital programme, which is appendix, whatever it is, C. Are they just things on there that we want to do that we're not doing? Because there's no figures against them. Because I noticed one of them is obviously the Bow Manor Road resurfacing, which anyone who's tried to drive down it, unless you've got a tank, it's becoming almost impossible. And I suspect that presumably we must be getting claims from people trying to get down there. But it comes back to what we're saying about tradie services. Nowhere does it account for future capital requirements in the MRP on it against the cost of running it. And the other one that interested me is something called the Bassett Centre, which I'm reliably told earlier today was in Wigston. I don't know what they do in the Bassett Centre, but bearing in mind we've got an empty building here, do we need it? Because if we don't need it, we don't then need to spend £85,000 on windows for it. So are we actually rationalising our property portfolio quick enough when we have an empty campus here, which we seem to be giving more and more over to the NHS? So we're almost an NHS campus rather than a county council anymore.
So in terms of the box at the bottom, you're absolutely right there. That's just purely to let you know what is being sort of discussed, but hasn't either had a business case that justifies the spend, or like I say, it's early stage and hasn't been worked up. So that future developments piece at the bottom is just for sort of, I suppose, members' information about what is potentially coming down the track. In terms of the Bassett Centre, it's just one of the locality offices in sort of Overview. So they have been, we tend to review 2 district areas a kind of a year, just challenging which sort of assets are worth keeping. And the Bassett Centre is one that came up that it was worth keeping. I don't know 100% what is in there. I think it's a mixture of things like registrars, social workers, etc. So it tends to be just those quite small locality offices that we still have got a handful of. But you're absolutely right. We do challenge what can come back to County Hall versus what should still require a dedicated office.
You want to come in?
Can I just say the Memphis Centre is run from the Bassett Centre, and that's why they are in dire need of windows. I can promise you they're literally at the point of almost hanging out. It's a wonder Storm didn't sort of fetch them out. And the Memphis Centre's been there for a number of years now, because I know we counted it a deal or made an arrangement with the Memphis Centre, and I actually went and opened it a few years ago. So Memphis is, a large organisation which is provided in that building.
Thanks, Chair. If someone said that's where the Memphis Centre was, I wouldn't know where the Bassett Centre was. I've been several times, but it doesn't alter the fact that, do we take into a calculation, Declan, not just the services that are provided there, but the ongoing cost of maintaining that building to run those services out of? Because you can't just look and say, well, it's nice to have that service there, but by the way, it's going to cost us £250 million to keep them in the building. It's lovely to have the service there, but we might not be able to keep them there because the cost to maintain the building is too great. So I'm never quite sure when we do these reviews do we look at everything? I'm slightly worried we do reviews looking at individual silos rather than the totality of the issue.
They do put that challenge on about whether it does need to be based on the locality or whether it can just be sort of, is it a broad sort of county-wide type service? And I can give you assurance on that. When they do go down, they do try and put that tension in the system between maybe what people prefer on an individual basis versus what the county actually needs.
Okay, shall we therefore move on? Yep, if we therefore move on to item 11, thank you everyone participated in that item, which is the final one of the 4 MTFS items, in which we consider the responses from the other overview and scrutiny committees regarding the relevant parts of the MTFS, which they've looked into in respect of each department. Copy of the minutes extracts from each of the committees were circulated to all members on Friday, and these have been published on the council's website. Officers, lead members, did you have any comments you wanted to add to the various reports? No? Mr. Bracken.
Yeah, can I just say, it was interesting when Declan opened on the MTFS item this morning, and obviously the committees form part of the closest scrutiny of each of the main areas of business. He obviously said about using the sort of terms. Last year we used it as the hardest budget we'd had to set. This year's the toughest budget. Interesting, Declan. I think we'd avoid using Declan's creeping death sort of term, because I think that would be a statement too far. But I think I think as a council, we acknowledge the funding, the ministerial statement that we had last week, the extra additional funding that's coming through. A lot of work's gone into that. It's obviously not enough because we're probably underfunded by 20% against our provision of services for children's and adult social care. I think generally we are a very prudent organisation and a very prudent administration here through the officers, not afraid to take tough decisions, and I think we are decisions that we make, I think we challenge hard, I think through scrutiny and I think through consultation. We've always done that, and we've got consultations that are out at the moment which will come back to us. I think the assurance for me was that members, we obviously now have financial controls in place, which we put in place due to the extreme financial positions that we're in. They will ensure that we deliver savings and obviously eliminate non-essential spend. And I just go back to Simone touched on it, and she said in the initial report we had the it was actually on paragraph, I think it was 54 in the early part of the document. It related to, it's paragraph 54, page 24, and it was Declan's summary as Director of Corporate Resources, but he's also our Section 151 officer. That assurance can be given that the budget estimates are considered to be robust and the earmark reserves adequate. And I think really that is a key element of the report that we have, and all the committee work that you've done. I just have to applaud, chairs and members and officers that have been scrutinised, because I think once again the reports that I've looked through as part of your report here today show that you've done a very in-depth job. I know sometimes conversations here cross over, and I think if members sat on each of the committees, they'd have realised that was discussed in greater detail. But just really, make that statement. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Brecken. So we've got the chairs of most of the committees here. I don't know if any of you wish to make any comments or highlight anything to the Commission at this stage. Mrs. Pryor.
Thank you very much, Chair. Well, everybody, I'm sure, if they haven't managed to read the report of the Children and Families Overview and Scrutiny Committee yet, will do in due course. This is one of the most, expensive and costly services that we have to do. And for our children in care, we now grow up to the age of 25. The SEND programme is very much expanding. There's an awful lot of children that require our help and care, and we have a duty to do it. I have to echo what Mr. Brecken said, that the staff within this department are fully aware of how expensive it is, but at the end of the day, and they're working very hard, and with other people like the looking at new ways to help these children and young people. And I would just on record like to say that we are looking at it. We're doing the best we can, but it is very, very difficult. And if you go back into detail into papers for that meeting, the upward line of people that we're now looking over after compared to even 5 years ago is enormous. But it is a statutory requirement as well. But yes, I do have to thank them for the work they do. And we are aware of what it costs, but that we have to do it.
Thank you, Mrs. Fryer. Do any of the other chairs, Mr. Frisbee?
Yeah, thank you, both the colleagues. As Chair of Environment and Climate Change, it's been a viscous landscape. It's a subject that is can be a contentious, politically hot potato. It ping-pongs around. I'd like to thank particularly the officers and the people who supported that committee, that we've had a collective and harmonious focus group that's all worked towards a shared agenda, which I think is very, very important. There's often accusations of greenwashing and all sorts of things, but I think ultimately at the end of the day, everybody wants the same thing, and that is a sustainable future for our environment. So I echo what my colleagues say, that I think we've worked very, very hard to try and come up with something that's tangible and realistic against a very complex background. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Frisbee. Mr. Richardson.
suppose better say something. As chairman of adults communities, I mean, I think the key point is that if one looks at the adults communities budget, you can imagine where it would have been had we not gone through the target operating model exercise. So the money now being spent is roughly, I think, what would have been spent had we not gone through that model. So it's allowed for those increases. So yeah, one's always sceptical about these projects when they come in, but this is a project which has truly delivered. I think had the council not done it, our deficit would have been so much larger. But more importantly, because it's not always about money what we do here as a council, we have more people living a longer, healthier life in their own homes, which I think is the key to it. And I would like to acknowledge, in actual fact, Mr. Meara is one of our committee members who was bold enough to say that that whilst he was very sceptical about the community libraries project, it has been a massive success. And I think it just goes to show that councillors across all persuasions don't always play politics all the time, but recognise when something has come in and worked. And I think it truly has, and has been a wonderful innovation across the county.
Thank you, Mr. Richardson. Any of the other chairs want to come in at this point? No. And Mr. Gillard, did you want to add anything?
No, I apologise for not being at the last meeting due to vacation, but I'd like to thank the Highways team, officers particularly, for the tremendous amount of hard work they do under extremely difficult circumstances, such as the recent flooding we've had, and I'm grateful to Amanda for bringing that to the last meeting. Potholes, we know, SEN, there's a whole plethora of problems we have to deal with, and we do our best, we're working through it, and I'm very grateful for the support of the officers and the committee for their valuable inputs.
Thank you, Mr. Gillard. Anyone else want to come? Mrs. Hack.
I just wanted to wait till all the chairs have spoken, so I didn't want to jump in. I think the question really is for the officers. Obviously, the scrutiny process was, the papers were in train before we had Storm Hank, and we had all of those people experiencing flooding in their homes. Now, I understand there's obviously legal processes that need to go to do the flood assessment. Is that something? What's the cost of the authority? Do we have a sort of a view on whether, how much of the contingency that may well cover? Because that wasn't available at the highways meeting, but I'm sure the environment and the climate change scrutiny would also be interested in that.
The chairman and I thank everybody. The detailed reports are on the agenda on your email, but I think we are very grateful to all the chairs and the officers, because this has been a very difficult year, and I'm sure it will be difficult in the years to come, but we're most grateful. And over to you for the next item.
Thank you, Mrs. Page. Did you want to come in, Mr. Page?
Yes, thank you, Chair. Thanks for that. I appreciate we're only looking at the comments from the committees, and I haven't read all their individual reports, but you know, I think for all of us, it doesn't give any of us any pleasure to you say, oh, let's stop doing this or let's stop doing that. But I think what we have got to be clear about is that whatever services and whatever systems we're operating as a county council, that we are operating those and doing those in the most cost efficient and most effective way. And I think what I'm still think there are some areas where I think we aren't perhaps as efficient and as effective as we maybe need to be, and so I think there are opportunities for, you know, increased savings, if we put it like that. But equally, you know, what I think is from the overall report is that, you know, when you look at the growth, you know, there's actually, I think, is it 289 million of capital investment in service improvements, and that's a substantial amount that the authority is going to be putting into developing services to improve them at a time when it's seen obviously under serious financial constraints. So I don't want it to be seen as it's all doom. that's the wrong expression, all doom and gloom. That's not the right expression, but all negative. There are some positives, but you know, we have got to be, and it just says the officers appreciate an awful lot of work has gone into producing the reports and looking for all the available savings. But I think one of the, and I suppose it is frustration, isn't it? There's some of these things, it just takes time for some of them to come to fruition. But no, I think overall I'm quite content with the report, especially if we can come to a satisfactory outcome of the Market Harborough Household Waste site.
Thank you for your comment, Councillor Flynn.
Thank you. And thank you again to all the scrutiny committees for all their work over the last year. These comments of the scrutiny committees will be passed to the Cabinet for consideration along with our comments today. Do members wish to take a short break for about 10-15 minutes? Items to carry on. Okay, if members wish to carry on, let's carry on. So it moves us, thank you, moves us on to item 12, which is the draft revised Investing in Leicestershire Programme Portfolio Management Strategy 2024-2028, which is on pages 103 to 142. In addition to the main report, members would have received a supplementary report on this item, which was circulated and published last week. This includes the review provided by Hymans Robertson and a further amended version of the strategy. I believe Declan will be introducing the report, and we also have Mr. Philip Pearson from Hymans Robertson, who's joined us online. Welcome, Philip, and he will, I think, also give a short presentation as part of this item. And we've also got Mr. Brecken here still with us. So if I hand over to yourself, Declan.
Thank you, Chair. Last year we saw significant changes to the strategy off the back of all the sort of SIPFA code recommendations. So this year the changes are much more measured. Although members will note that there is a nod in there to sort of greater sort of focus on the management of the existing assets as we approach the investment cap for the Investing Leicestershire programme. If we think about 3 years ago, Hymans undertook an independent review of the strategy, and they've repeated this exercise this year to check the balance of the portfolio is right and its high level aims. And I just stress for sort of the members' benefit, that doesn't get down to the sort of the appraisal of individual assets. It is more that overarching kind of look at have we got the balance and the objectives right. You'll notice Philip's on the screen behind me, so he'll talk through the sort of the review that did perform, so you get sort of a chance to sort of opportunity to sort of ask questions. So I won't go through the Hymans paper at all. And the only other point I'd stress is that Hymans do the due diligence on the sort of the diversifying assets. So if you do want to get into a bit of detail on those, Philip's in a good position to kind of respond on those. So before I pass over to Philip, just pass to Lee to see whether he's got any comments on the programme.
I think I'm okay at this moment. Thank you.
Philip, did you want to thank you.
Yes, of course. Thank you, Chair, and a very good afternoon to everyone. I do have a short presentation bringing out the main findings of our review and the recommendations. Also doing a bit of an update on the property market, which is obviously the main focus of the portfolio, and where a lot has happened, as I'm sure everyone knows, in the last 3 years. Can everybody see those now?
Yeah, that's visible. Yeah.
Great. Okay. So, talked about the agenda. I'll start with the property market update. What I was looking for here was a single chart to summarize what's happened in the property market in the last 3 years, and this I think is the best one. Here I'm showing the net initial yield, so that's rental income on property divided by the price of the property over quite a few years, and it highlights, I think, a number of really important things. Firstly, in the green block, just how expensive, in other words, low yielding property had become by the end of 2021. Secondly, you can see to the right hand side of the chart where yields have risen sharply, which equates to a fall in the pricing of property, just how significant the repricing of property has been in the last couple of years. What's also quite clear is the divergence in the in the fortunes of different sectors of the property market over the last few years. So picking out the three main sectors, retail, you can see that in the yellow, that yields have risen quite sharply over the last few years. That as a result of rents falling, but capital values falling even quicker. And we do believe that retail is now becoming more reasonably priced as a result of those movements. Office in the blue, slightly different position. Here rents have been pretty flat for quite a few years now overall, but capital values have fallen a bit, but we think office still looks expensive on a historical view, and also given the headwinds facing that sector. And then finally, industrial in the red, very, very different experience, strong rental growth. Capital values have fallen, which is why the yield has gone up. Still looks expensive on a historical view, but we think is a more interesting sector simply because of the strength of rental growth. So this is the market context, if you will, for our findings and recommendations around the portfolio. If I start off just talking through the current portfolio, and the first thing I would say is that we do believe that the overall objectives, the target return and the high level strategy of the fund remain absolutely appropriate. So there's nothing in these recommendations that is particularly revolutionary. This chart summarises what's in the current portfolio and the composition, and in particular I would highlight 68% allocation to direct property, and a 32% allocation to diversifiers, which are various pool funds investing in a number of different asset classes. We think that's a very appropriate mix. You'll also see that development account property, the properties in development account for 20% of the overall fund, or 30% of the direct property portfolio. This is a high percentage, but again, we think that's appropriate given the aim of this portfolio is, yes, to generate a financial return, but also to have a positive economic and social impact on Leicestershire. Further down the page, you'll see the diversifiers, pooled property funds, pooled private debt funds, and pooled infrastructure funds. We do think these are all appropriate diversifiers, but as Declan alluded to, because of the changes in the PWLB lending criteria and in the SIPFA code since the last review, it will not be possible to make any further commitments to property and infrastructure pooled funds. So a few words on performance, which is also mentioned in this table. The performance of the direct portfolio has been really strong relative to the wider property market, given the headwinds in the market. So it's done really, really well. The performance of the diversifiers, though, has been mixed. The pooled property funds run by Aegon and Lothbury has been generally poor. The funds run by Hermes and Threadneedle in property, and the private debt funds run by Partners have been very satisfactory. And the infrastructure fund run by JP Morgan and the so-called Bank Risk Transfer Fund run by CRC has been very, very strong indeed. Overall, though, on the diversifiers, a mixed result. Looking forward, we do believe that this portfolio has the potential to deliver the fund's targeted return over the long term. So if I move now to recommendations, firstly, some recommendations on overall composition. The first one being to maintain the overall composition of the portfolio, and in particular the direct and diversifying split. Within the direct portfolio, we are recommending maintaining or ideally reducing the exposure to offices, given the headwinds that I mentioned earlier on. Increasing the allocation to industrials and logistics, partly because you are underweight the wider market, partly because this particular sector continues to have very positive supply and demand characteristics. We're suggesting selectively investing in retail, which may be a controversial recommendation, particularly given that retail as a sector still faces some significant headwinds. But we are conscious that the UK still needs some retail property. The successful formulas in this market are starting to become clear, and therefore a very selective approach to investing we think is now appropriate. We do think you should focus on retail, which is part of wider regeneration activity, and obviously also retail properties that have a very strong tenant proposition. We're suggesting maintaining rural, and then within the other property sectors, couple of things to focus on there. One, residential. So once the current developments are complete, residential will be well over 20% of your direct portfolio. We think it's absolutely appropriate. You should have a material allocation to residential, but given it is relatively lower yield, we would suggest capping the allocation to that sector at 15% of the directs. So that's it in terms of the different direct property sectors, with some suggested changes in allocations there. Clearly, any change in allocation needs to be driven by the opportunity set, and particularly the quality of the individual propositions. On the diversifiers side, the allocation to pooled property funds will naturally fall, partly because some of the funds are returning capital, and one of the funds, the Loughborough Property Trust, is in liquidation. So the allocation there will fall, but if possible, we would recommend maintaining it at around 25% of the overall of the diversifiers portfolio. On infrastructure, good diversifying asset class, but you can't make any more allocations to that through pooled property, through pooled infrastructure funds. So we're recommending maintaining that allocation. And then on private debt, here we're recommending increasing the allocation, but diversifying it. So within that portfolio, I've bracketed in the bank risk transfer investments, which have performed very well, but we are recommending allowing that allocation to fall as those opportunities are realised. And the reason for that is we think that the risk profile of that strategy is not consistent with the overwhelming need for strong capital protection in this portfolio. So that will gradually run off. We do think there are a number of other opportunities to diversify the risk within pooled private debt, in particular to consider allocating to a second corporate lending manager, and also considering other segments of the private debt market. So real asset-backed senior debt, for example, is a potentially attractive opportunity that could be considered. So that's it on portfolio composition. There are a number of other recommendations mentioned on this slide. I won't go through them all in detail. I would just highlight a couple for the committee's attention. Firstly, down the bottom of the left-hand side of the slide, to do a review of the refurbishment plans and the associated capex requirements of the direct property portfolio. Reason for that is twofold. One is we have found it's very easy to understate the refurbish requirements and the associated capex for a property portfolio, and that's particularly so at the moment with prospective environmental legislation coming in. And then down the bottom of the right-hand side, a recommendation relating to the overall portfolio is to undertake some further work to figure out what additional actions will be needed over the coming years to ensure this portfolio contributes what it needs to Leicestershire's overall net zero objectives. That's it in terms of the findings and recommendations. Let me pause there and see if there are any questions.
Thank you, Philip. Does anyone have any questions for Philip? Mr. Richardson.
Just really page 20, portfolio review. Massively concerned about the underperformance of the rural sector, where we're showing a net income return of minus 1.7%, and that's highlighted further in your report when you talk about the unlet areas, which might be unlicensed, but they're not performing. And presumably this is also coupled with the problem we had with clearing one of the farms at a cost of in excess of 2 million. So I suppose my question is at what point it does indicate in there that we're starting to look at rural property and looking at those which might be worth considering more, because it does say the capital appreciation has been good, but there must be a mix between those areas which have got really good capital appreciation, could hold us good, and those that will never appreciate in capital, where perhaps we should be moving out of the sector while prices are high and investing those money in other factors. And the other question I've got, which is a silly little one, but it'll help me on the next paper, is I assume that since we stopped having Snibston Cafe as part of trading services, it's now gone into this portfolio. But to help me understand the other portfolio, what are we actually earning out of Snibston Cafe, so I can compare it to the other ones for the next report, because presuming that information must be in this report somewhere.
I can't comment, I'm afraid, on particular properties such as the one you mentioned in your second question. But let me comment on the allocation to rural overall. Your first question. We absolutely do think that rural property has a part to play in this portfolio. We have suggested maintaining the allocation. We think it's at about the appropriate proportion of the overall portfolio. We're very conscious that supporting rural property is aligned with the, if you will, the sort of non-financial goals of the fund in terms of economic and social impact on the county. All that said, it is very important that every property in this portfolio is contributing a financial return and/or economic and social impact. And if that's not the case today, that there is a clear plan in place with appropriate capex, if necessary, to support it, to ensure that each property can contribute what's necessary over a reasonable time frame. The final recommendation, the recommendation at the bottom of the left-hand column on the screen about reviewing refurbishment plans and associated capex requirements, that also covered all the rural properties as well, and we haven't had sight of those refurbishment plans, but we do think it would be appropriate to review them and make sure that every property is going to deliver what's required, and if not, dispose. So you'll see further up that column of recommendations that we are recommending exploring opportunities to dispose of selected properties. And there are a variety of reasons for doing that. One is a property is just not performing, but two would be to free up capital to invest in further developments, which is good from the perspective of creating economic and social impact. And that may well be the appropriate answer for a number of the rural properties.
Just picking up the Snibston point, Snibston doesn't touch the Investing in Leicestershire programme. That just forms part of the the country parks budget. All the Investing in Leicestershire ones are I suppose, it's just properties held for somebody else to operate on the site. Whereas obviously the cafe, even though we've got somebody else operating, is part of that kind of country parks offer, as it were. So that's why we've just kept it separate there. So if you want to cover that one, we can pick it up in the traded services paper next.
Mrs. Page.
I'm sure Terry, while Terry is thinking, just simplify this for me, please. So what we're saying that every property will be bringing or should be bringing a financial return over a reasonable period of time. Your bullet points say regular review the refurbishment plans, etc. So what happens? So I've got to get my head around it. So we're looking at the property. If they're really dilapidated or whatever, do we refurbish them and then, or do we get straight away? How are we fitting in the refurbishment and the cost into our overall plan in order to ensure it's worth it, if you see what I mean? So if the refurbishment for something costs too much money in order to bring a plan over a reasonable time, so then how can you talk me around it? Because if you refurbish something and it doesn't bring an investment for 50 years, it isn't. Yeah, just talk me around that, please. Thank you.
So you've hit the nail on the head in terms of reviewing the refurbishment and the capex plans for properties. Before any commitment is made, you have to believe that the property, once refurbished, will generate an acceptable financial return for the fund, or a positive impact. And if the answer is no, then the refurbishment shouldn't happen, and probably the property should be sold and bought by someone who believes they can do something with it.
If I may, yes, may I come back, please? And then how about the cost of marketing and getting it all ready? Because being a authority, we have got staff and resourcing issues, and sometimes it takes a very, very long time to get something on the road. Then, you know, planning or whatever else, should all of that be featured into the process in order to get that financial return?
The cost of doing any refurbishment, if you decide to keep a particular property, or the cost of marketing and selling a property if you don't, absolutely should be reflected in the case that's considered for each property. We're also very well aware that that disposing of properties and refurbishing properties is very expensive on officer time. So it is important to prioritise and really to have a continuing programme of asset reviews that ensures that the whole portfolio is reviewed and, if necessary, action is taken over the long term. But you cannot do it all in one go.
My last point through you, Chairman. So you're saying there should also, all of this should be underpinned by action plans and timelines in order to get the best value.
Exactly.
Mrs. Hack.
Thank you. You said at the start of your presentation that the portfolio's role is for the social and economic benefit of Leicestershire, and the word social and economic is littered in through the reports. But in terms of the recommendations, what would you anticipate being the social benefit of Leicestershire? Because we've dealt with very much on the economic and looking at fund performance, but what I don't get yet is what social and economic benefits we'll get in terms of the fund. So, you know, we talked about more investment in industrial, less in this area. How is that going to be shaped in terms of improving the overall market conditions for Leicestershire?
So the economic and social impacts of this portfolio will definitely vary between the different sectors within the direct portfolio. Industrial, you're right. I think the impacts there are predominantly economic. But take, for example, the residential portfolio, which, when current developments are complete, will account for a decent chunk of the direct portfolio. Clearly better supply of high quality, affordable housing has significant, I would argue, significant social impact for the county.
To come back, Mrs. Hack.
Yeah, I mean, it was probably just to draw out a little bit further. It isn't clear that the residential is affordable homes. There's nothing that's referenced in the document on that basis, but also most of the investments that are sitting in there at the moment are commercial only. And I think if we're looking at the social and economic benefit of Leicestershire, at what point do we start looking at how do we generate organisations to come into Leicestershire that do different things? You know, we're investing in industrial. I think the private sector is pretty much happy doing that on its own. What do we need to do in terms of generating economic wealth in Leicestershire that the market can't do by itself? And that's what I've sort of got in my head. But I suppose the other question is maybe is for Declan, is around a point at which we are in a situation where we've identified all the way through this paper that we've got less money, but we're looking to invest more, increase the amount of investment. So how do we square that circle?
I'll pick these up here. In terms of the social piece, you're right. There's sort of I don't think we could do it anyway. We can't crowd out the private sector. It kind of undermines the point of trying to do or key point of trying to do the programme. If you look at things like Airfield Farm, Leaders Farms, Airfield Farm to get off the ground needed sort of European development funding. So there was kind of it laid sort of vacant for sort of decades before sort of intervened. So I think you're right. We can't, if we stray too much into trying to mimic what the private sector does, we'll probably sort of, we'll come unstuck there. So it is about identifying those areas where we've maybe either already got the land or it's something we can see the sort of potential we can kind of, develop up something that somebody else hasn't been interested in. But the root of it, just by the nature of this programme, is going to be economic, is hopefully the thing that drives some of the social benefits as well. In terms of the greater investment, you're right. I mean, it is that balance between how much more you put into this programme versus where else you could put your money to kind of that sort of spend to save basis. So the programme is approaching, I suppose, its investment cap at the moment. So there isn't an intention to increase it further, and we are trying to find opportunities to sort of, I suppose, broaden the base of where we invest money. So the social care investment programme is an example for that. That's outside of SCIP, but we are buying residential property to refurbish either into adults or children's accommodation to enable that. So, but you are right, it's a balance, and every time we come with an investment proposal, whether it's a refurbishment one that sort of Councillor Page mentioned or a new build, we do that kind of the business price appraisal. Is it worth it compared to the potential cost of sort of debt that we might incur in the future, although we're not incurring debt yet? Is it worth it compared to other aspects? We do that appraisal. At the moment, it stacks up okay, mainly because if we get a property and we get it right, you're getting the benefit for 25 years rather than sort of just a short-term kick. But yeah, it has to be at the front of our minds.
Mr. Brecken, did you want to?
Yeah, thank you. It was just really to say the rural estate's been mentioned a couple of times by Commission over the last few sort of meetings, and certainly a lot of the rural estate at the moment exists within emerging local plans, calls for sites. There's a lot of land tied up there. Obviously, we just made some money back on the land from the Metal Mobley distributor that was sold as part of that development. We've also got rural estates at the moment that are being looked at for possible green energy. So they are potentials that we're looking at, and we are sort of looking to make sure that we are maximising that estate. A lot of work's been done this year on that. I just welcome sort of Philip's report. I mean, the 3 yearly scrutiny is good, and I think the recommendations will go through to the ILP board, which obviously will look at those in detail. But I just think it's positive that we still have this financial contribution that we get from a revenue and supplementing our own revenue and capital resources that we have coming in. So it's welcome it.
Thank you, Mr. Brecken. Mr. King.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Right, so essentially this is a wrapper, isn't it? The Invest in Leicestershire programme. It's a wrapper of our assets, which we've rebadged Invest in Leicestershire. So we've got land that we own, which we already owned before we had this, and we've just said that's now in kind of in this fund, in this programme, as I understand. And then since then we've gone on to buy or develop at different sites, which meet different criteria within the objectives of the Invest in Leicestershire programme. That's as I understand, and alongside that we've got investments in direct financial products on the market, which I assume Hymans and other advisors are advising us we should invest in. But to my mind, that strikes me more of a treasury management programme rather than Invest in Leicestershire programme. It's just an investment fund we're investing in rather than on the market. So what I was a little bit concerned about, and I had some concern. So we've got this report, which is very, very helpful. But then part of the revenue budget for Invest in Leicestershire programme, that's under corporate services, corporate resources department, and that's something we've already been gone through. And then you've got the corporate capital programme, which is also shown in that. In the expected investment over the next 4 years, plus the potential future developments, which I think cumulatively comes to about 117 million. But I appreciate only 60, just under 62 is what is in the budget, corporate capital budget. But a couple of items there with the estimated completion dates just raise an element of concern for me, knowing a little bit about more what's going on with timetables elsewhere. The Lutterworth East in the capital programme says that, it's stated that you have drive-through restaurants and planning and pre-highway construction works. Estimated completion date by March 25. Right, I have to say I think that's very, very optimistic. I really think that's overly optimistic, and then also in Philip's report, it actually states about selling off part of Lutterworth East to reduce the exposure. Again, given where it is in the process, I'm not quite sure how. I think it's very optimistic that that's likely to happen in the next year and a bit or so. Maybe it will, but it's a bit unclear to me whether the plan is sufficient. The plans are sufficiently advanced to deliver on that at the moment against the timetable that's kind of indicated in the reports that are before us today. So I'm just wondering if anyone can shed any further light on these kind of dates and expected timelines that you're looking at and where things are up to. Thank you.
Okay, I'll pick those up. So the summation of ILP is right. It started off, its genesis was some existing assets we own, whether rural estate, industrial, and then we've either added to that by land purchase, or we've added to it by sort of construction type costs. So your starting point is correct. In terms of the diversifiers, they are a mixture of treasury management and sort of straight investment. If there's an underlying asset like property or infrastructure, we have to cast them as capital. If they're things like the debt, where the underlying assets alone, we can class it as treasury management. The reason we group them here is to have a properly balanced kind of investment portfolio. If it's just property, it's obviously sort of skewed, particularly if that property is just in Leicestershire. So it's looking at it in that lens. The point of sort of some of these is to be deliberately different to it. So although it's treasury management, we do bring it together just so we can have that sort of balanced portfolio. Because by the nature of you saw Philip's first chart, every asset class goes through different ups and downs. So by having different asset classes, it just allows you to kind of take that sort of up and down risk as things operate in a different way. So that's the pure reason we do that. In terms of the Lutterworth East, apologies, it's a typo in the report. I hadn't picked that up, but where it says Lutterworth East drive-through restaurants, that's actually Leaders Farm. So that's the units where there is already planning permission, there's already a deal with the eventual occupier. So it's just a case of getting construction sort of contract in place and develop them out. So it's a very different, so you're quite right to pull us up on that. So it's a very different thing. In terms of Lutterworth East itself, again, that's just the enabling works. And you're right, Lutterworth, east of Lutterworth, 3,000 odd house sort of scheme is a kind of a multi-year kind of project. And we've got a decision as a council how we sort of go forward with that. Obviously, sort of COVID doesn't help, sort of the resulting kind of infrastructure kind of cost increase haven't helped with that. So we're working through that at the moment. So there isn't a fixed plan at Lutterworth East. It's going to get sort of formed over the next few months. But again, you're right, it's not likely to be kind of completely resolved in the next year. It's too big a scheme for that.
Thanks for that clarification, Declan.
Mr. Richardson.
Just to be a pedant while we're talking about errors, page whatever it is, 134, where we talk about amount of tenanted farmland disposed of versus acquired. So we're getting rid of 126 acres, it says, but we've actually lost 215 acres. So presumably someone snuck off with 80 acres without telling us. I know residents get a bit obsessed with these sort of things.
Just on that one, I think it's not that clear. The first column is 22, 23. The final column is 26, 27. Yeah, so I think they've just.
So you think there's a bit in the middle? We sold 80 in the middle.
Yeah,
that's fair enough.
Okay, thank you.
It's nice. I'd happily live there.
Okay, is that all the comments, questions on this item? Okay, so thank you to everyone who's participated, and to Philip and Declan and Mr. Brecken. So it brings us on to item 13, which is the final item of the day, the interim report requested by the Commission on the Traded Services Strategy. Richard Hunt, Head of Catering, Hospitality and Country Parks, is introducing this item, supported by Declan Keegan and Jane Glasgow, Assistant Director, and Mr. Brecken is remaining for the item as well. So, I
will need to leave at 1:15. So,
okay,
thank you.
Thank you. Right. Are you interested, Richard, please? Yeah.
Good afternoon, everybody. Scrutiny Commission last considered traded services at their meeting in June 2023, at which the annual report for Leicestershire Traded Services was considered, and also at that point the revised traded services strategy, which was later adopted by Cabinet. Commissioners at the meeting asked for a follow-up workshop to explore some of the themes that had been raised in that meeting back in June, acknowledging that some of them were commercially sensitive and acknowledging you just wanted more time to be able to consider them. And that workshop was held in October. And also members asked for an interim update on commercial performance in early 2024. So that being the purpose of today's meeting. So the paper aims to set out some of the themes explored in the workshop back in October, which included the origins of each of the services that make up the portfolio that we call Leicestershire Traded Services, and particularly that none of them had been originally established in order to generate a purely financial contribution to the County Council, and also that many of the services had a broader benefit to corporate services within the County Council, as well as sometimes social benefits to communities around the county. Members also explored the relative financial contributions made by service areas and observed that there were significant differences in margin depending on the type of services between the different elements within the portfolio. Members expressed concern about the level of financial return from certain services, and in particular, we spoke in some detail about cafes, Bow Manor and school food within that meeting. And we also noted the extensive impact that the pay award and general inflation over the past couple of years had on services and squeezing their margins quite considerably. The paper then goes on to set out from paragraph 21 the year-to-date performance of services within the traded services portfolio. It's probably best, I think, summed up saying that this year we forecast that in almost all areas income will outperform the budget. So on the one hand, performance has been really quite pleasing this year. However, it's inescapable that this is within a context of costs rising significantly, which has meant that margins have continued to be squeezed. So I'd say it's very much kind of a picture of two halves. As we've set out within the paper, the absolute highest priority areas for us remain school food and Bow Manor, where there are considerable transformation programmes underway at present. The final section of the paper sets out some of our longer term strategic thinking on how we might evaluate services that we trade. Clearly, financial return is the most important criteria, but we've set out other elements that help us to evaluate services, which range from either fit with corporate function through to benefits for social benefits for communities in Leicestershire and further afield. And members may wish to comment on some of these proposed criteria and also on our current focuses of whether our current focuses of service development are the correct ones.
Thank you, Richard. Mr. Becken, but yeah, if you've got to leave, trying to make any comments.
Yeah, I think Richard's been giving you an honest assessment of where we are. I think the workshop that you had was deep, and I think members raised their concerns. I think those concerns were noted, and I think, yeah, I'd say to any member that if we have a traded services that we can't put on the right footing and it can't stand on its own 2 feet, that they will be looked at. When Richard came to you last time, you had a performance plan, if you like, for each service that wasn't performing, and he went through those. He told you what we're looking to do in the next 12 months, and in the next 12 months, if they're not right, they will be looked at with a view to sort of offsetting and removing and doing other things with, and it could well be that we dispose of that traded service. But I think Richard's given you a good set of criteria that we could evaluate again. I'm sure members will have other comments, but yeah, I mean, welcome sort of Commission's views, but I think it probably will be more work to be done, as I say, probably not in this open sort of arena as well. So it might have to be another workshop that we look at. But okay, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Bracken. Mr. Richardson, did you?
Yeah, just a couple. I appreciate what you say about you're anticipating doing better than the budget. My question is, has the budget been set correctly? So if we're still setting a budget that says we're going to waste £250,000 next year, clearly the budget hasn't been set properly. Because otherwise, why do we think it's worth wasting £250,000? Which is what looking at all the services, what the total contribution of this council is. So in relation to that one little question I asked about Snibston Cafe. Now, Snibston Cafe, which was the newest one, was a bit of a disaster. I understand a councillor here made a big play for getting it outsourced, which has been done, and it's now running great guns. So what is the contribution to this council from Snibston Cafe? If you're able to tell me, you might not be able to because commercial sensitivity, I realise, because I need to compare that then to a net contribution from the two cafes we've still got of a pathetic 36,000 in the next financial year, which is 1,000 up from this year. So presumably if we set a budget that's 1,000 increase, well, I could do that. But I mean, you know, to have a cafe that's contributing 12,000 quid is just pointless. We might as well outsource it to a commercial operator, as we have done with Snibston, and do it that way. Now, when it comes to Bow Manor, as a wider issue, I've already mentioned earlier that we've got major capital investment to make, because I suspect within the next 6 to 8 months, no one will be able to get to Bow Manor because of the state of the road. Now, you're looking there at probably the best part, I'm guessing, at the length of that road, of even if you filled it with mill waste and did a bit of tarmacking, you're looking at the best part of £1 million. Now, that bears no relationship to the ongoing costs of running that operation in here. And again, you know, having been there as I have recently, the whole place is tired inside. It needs decorating. It needs new carpets. There's a huge amount of capital investment you'd have to make to turn that round. So I just wonder where we're going with trading services, because I've been on this committee now for 6, 8 years. Every year I've raised the same questions and it's been a disaster. Every year I've been told it's being turned around and it gets worse. And it even admits here in the report that the contracts that were written for the food services were incorrect. And no one still answered the question I've asked twice today already, is how could we put forward such appalling contracts with the impact on this council without somebody actually reading them and thinking about what was in the contract? So who wrote the contracts? Did anyone bother checking them or reading them? And what assurance have we got that the new contracts now will adequately protect the council? Because I don't know who's looking at them or who's checking them, but whoever checked the first one didn't do a very good job. So let's hope whoever checked the new ones is doing a better job.
I'm happy to start with the cafe question. So, as you can imagine, we won't discuss the exact figures, but I think the broader point you're raising is absolutely the right point you're raising on the relative return from outsourcing versus operating in-house. And as you can imagine, we've done those calculations to compare. The mix of commercial deal that we have at Snibston, if it were broadly the same deal but applies to those other facilities, actually would return almost exactly what we're making at the moment operating in-house. So the broader question becomes, what is the most suitable operator for the services? And that is part of the process, as Mr. Bracken said, the process of looking at all the services and considering what should we be operating, what should we be looking to do differently, and things like that. That's part of that. So all those points raised by scrutiny last time we met about cafes, we've absolutely taken on board and are looking to do. I would say, though, the financial return that we see there is broadly speaking what we would expect to see if a similar deal was being done with the private sector.
Let's come back on that one specific point. I mean, I've looked at others in the area, notably something like the Outwards, which is run by Chambers Borough Council. Well, the return they're getting, and again, I won't talk about the figures, is substantially in excess of what we're getting from a tiny cafe. So I do not accept the view that it's roughly what we would get from the commercial centre. It's way lower than we would get in the commercial sector. I mean, you know, you shouldn't be, you know, if a commercial operator is offering you 12 grand to run a cafe, there's something seriously wrong with our negotiation skills.
Just picking on that point, it's only a negotiation to a certain point as far as, you know, how many people are actually interested. So when they did sort of outsource the Snibston Cafe, it was an open market sort of exercise. So it's the best available in the market at the time. And I can't remember, it was yourself or Councillor King raised the point that sort of during COVID we had a hard time running that cafe. So the starting point was kind of relatively low in terms of that sort of, it's not just a sort of a takeover run, it's actually a build a business. So we haven't outsourced, as it were, for forever. So you do get opportunities throughout the life of the cafe to improve that deal. But I think it is worth bearing in mind the context, particularly Snibston. It's a build the business as opposed to just sort of a significant amount of business being put on the plate. In terms of the couple of points made about Bowman, the scale of the sort of the road repairs, I haven't sort of seen figures anywhere near the £1 million mark. I think that'd only get into it if it was sort of the road was sort of structurally kind of underneath the road was damaged, or where they can actually sort of, you know, resurface along the top. It's the figure I saw, and I haven't seen a figure for quite a while on this, was sub £100,000 to sort of repatch the road. It to the point that's been made before about kind of investments, if we were investing that sort of level, you do it off sort of the business case basis. Is it worth the kind of the financial return we're going to get? Is it worth the kind of the other societal sort of benefits? Because we've talked about sort of Bow Manor before. It's not just about the weddings and the hall, it's about the outdoor education. So do agree with the point. Before we put significant money into that site, we do need to have a sort of a real good honest look at ourselves. Is it going to make the returns that we think? But at the moment, we don't believe the kind of the investment required for the road and some of the other bits and pieces is of that scale. If it was, we'd obviously have to sort of look carefully at it.
Jane.
Final point. I mean, if I may, I've got a little small bit of 200 yards worth of cycle track in my division, which needs to be put in place. The council itself has quoted 305,000 for putting in 200 yards of footpath and cycle track. My local parish council has looked at the road surfacing down to its allotment, and you're talking several £100,000 because it's patched with mill waste at the moment. So we know the length of that road, the state of the car park. We are talking massively significant sums. But coming back to the other question, and the other questions haven't been asked, is about how have we set the budget, and they do seem rather easy to obtain, and no one still yet, and I don't know why, I'll try for a fourth time, answered the contract question.
If I may come in on the contract one. So the contracts have been through a review over the last couple of years. As you're probably aware, the team that's sat in front of you, those previous contracts predate the team that's here now. And what we've done is we've taken external advice on the contracts and from specialists who are working within the sector and explicitly within school foods and that type of area, alongside with our legal teams. And those contracts have been set based on what we would anticipate those risk profiles to be, taking third-party advice, etc. Then that's compounded with a new bid review process, which was put in place during this period, so that there are certain criteria any new business or renewed business have to meet in order for that to be approved, for any deals or any contracts to be signed. Those have all been through a DMT level process where they've been reviewed, agreed, and then there's set criteria by which they go in. And if they don't meet the criteria, we then escalate those in for director level approval. So there has been a significant change as we've gone through that, and we've had to work through the legacy contracts, remove those legacy contracts, and then renegotiate the new contracts. And then there's a rolling renegotiation on an annual basis to ensure that we take into account, inflationary costs, whether that's for staffing, food costs, or anything else.
Quickly on the budget point, so it's important we set the budgets that are sort of realistic and obtainable. And I do take your point, you don't want to make them too easy. But if you look at just the school food one alone, we've gone from a 1.6 million cost this year, forecasting 500,000 costs next year. So although it's still the wrong side of kind of the profit line, that 1.1 million change represents a huge amount of work. It's a huge amount of, I suppose, ambition in changing the service. So Richard and his team are having to go in kitchen by kitchen and basically redefine the way that those kitchens operate. He's having to go sort of basically school by school and renegotiate the contracts and reframe it. So it's not it does influence what we can do on the other ones, because most of the sort of change resource is focused on around school food, but it is ambitious trying to sort of turn this sort of around. And sort of at the moment, the assessment is that, you know, there is a chance that there's light at the end of the tunnel, that a reasonable return can be made from that. If that assessment changes, then we need to reflect it. But I would disagree whether these are ambitious enough, just purely because it's school food is requiring a big turnaround exercise, and there is a lot of cost being taken out the system.
Did you?
Thank you. We've been going around on this subject for so long now, and we never seem to be coming to a conclusion here, and things have been said several times all over. But I'd just like to focus on page 143.30 and, well, 31 actually. And it says there, the Commission might like to consider whether the priority afforded to some of these elements is correct. Now, taking Kerry's point and other points, I'm not quite sure whether that is correct and what has been said, because the first thing says financial return versus risk. Well, I think what we should be looking at, it is not just the financial return, but it is the cost. And this is what we've been saying all along. How much does it cost us to run? And, you know, because there is a little bit more than the financial return at stake. Because there are all of these hidden extras, as we have just mentioned. And then it says the area of competitive advantage for LCC. Well, is there an area and that gives us a competitive advantage at running a catering outfit? Because, as I keep saying, we are not caterers, we are not developers. So should we not, what contribution does this actually make to LCC in the end game? And benefits to communities outside Leicestershire. Now, what does that mean, Richard? You know, why do I have my first priority? It is our rate-paying residents, the community of Leicestershire and whatever else. So can you talk me through? And then I think maybe at this point, members should comment on those criteria before we go forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Page. Yes, I think we'd really value a comment from members on these points to kind of go through, I suppose, the maybe just to tease out perhaps what we meant by some of these. Financial return is clearly not just income, it's absolutely financial return in its fullest sense, as we've tried to paint that broader picture within the numbers here. So that's absolutely what we mean there. Areas competitive advantage is saying that we should be considering when we're trading whether it's an area in which the county council has a specialism or not. And I suppose that's where some of those, you know, really live discussions we're all having about cafes are very different, say, to an example about offering specialist health and safety advice to the education sector, which I would say the county council is probably one of the most, you know, accomplished players that there is within the region. So it's that kind of thing that we're thinking about there, about saying, you know, we wouldn't just seek to trade everything. We should be looking to trade those areas in which we're very good at existing, or where we're filling a gap in the market where nobody else is. And then benefits to communities outside of Leicestershire. Clearly it's priority F. It's the lowest priority. I don't really see that it could be anything other than the lowest priority, given all the points you've made. But I think it's acknowledging that there are some services for whom there will be access from people outside of Leicestershire. Take, for example, the Century Theatre. You know, I would dearly love to be selling those tickets to anybody who'd like to buy those tickets outside of Leicestershire, because it brings in income and financial return for the county council. Also acknowledging that school food, you know, we do trade in areas outside of the county as well. So again, it's kind of linked through to some financial return. But if we were to be doing it without the financial return, it would absolutely be one of our lowest priorities.
I think it was Mr. King.
Yeah, I didn't mention that thing earlier, but what I was going to say is, but we've all got knowledge and experience of, some of us, of doing this at districts and other places that we're involved in, of, you know, outsourcing facilities and, you know, generating revenue for, and not just revenue, it's not just about revenue, it's also about a benefit to the community. So if you have, for example, just taking cafes, if you've got a good cafe operator, then that attracts visitors into a locality, which is a positive thing, because you want people to visit your parks and exercise, exercise and all of the rest, because there's health benefits with doing that. But if obviously you haven't got an offer that's attractive to people to go and visit, then less people will tend to go to those things. So it is important that if we are going to have such offers for residents, that whatever the offer is, it is strong and it is attractive to users of those facilities. And I'm not entirely convinced by what I've seen and what I've heard of some of these things that they are at the moment. And as others have said, I personally speaking, I know where the Century Theatre is. I'm sure the people who use it and go to it and all the rest of it love it, but I don't think that should be a priority for this authority and for the public purse to subsidise the operation of a theatre in Colville. I personally don't think that should be the case. Equally, I don't think we should be operating cafes in public parks. The days of that have long gone. We should be letting those out on renewable contracts. And so if we're not getting an adequate return, then we should be, testing the market on those things. And I mean, obviously the big one is school meal service. I am surprised we've lost, as Mr. Richardson's mentioned. I find that mind-boggling that we lost such an eye-watering amount of money on it. And yeah, it will be complicated to turn around, but I do think medium to long term, I don't think the county council should be operating a school meal service. I think there's plenty of private operators out there, both big and small, who would be very pleased to, I'm sure, operate such services. And as regards the professional and other services, I mean, I can see and I do understand some of the attraction of some of those services, because if it's badged as a county council public authority providing the service, then for some of those services that will give the users of those services a level of assurance that possibly that they're not being given incorrect advice. Doesn't necessarily follow, but you'd hope it would, or there's or they're not. So I think it is complicated with those, but equally I'm not entirely convinced that we should be running some of those either, because again, there are other providers out there who can provide a similar service at a competitive price. Maybe the fact we're in the market maybe does that affect the pricing in the marketplace. I don't know, but I think looking at the criteria, to me they are the right criteria. I just think we just need to get real. Our core business isn't operating visitor attractions or cafes or things like that. We need to get out of those as soon as possible. Thank you, Chair.
Mrs. Hack.
I have to be honest, I've been sitting here listening and I'm pretty shocked at some of the conversations that we've been having. I have to be honest with you. We've just had an investment paper on the previous session where we actually invested in a fund that's had to be liquidated, and then we're talking about some really key services for Leicestershire. In terms of school meals, I think we have to sort of go back to the fact that all schools used to be part of Leicestershire County Council, which is why we'd always done school meals, because it made sense to deliver many meals for all of our schools. I think if you actually go into the academies, you'd really see what they provide children and how much they charge for. So I would imagine our school meal service is wholesome, nutritionally balanced, and actually give our children the nutrition that they need to sustain on the day. that I don't know if that standard is exactly the same for all of our academies. So I think there's a real piece of context that we need. In terms of the loss, I think we also have to recognise food inflation went at 20%. 20%. So the way within which those contracts were drafted would never have considered that food inflation would have picked up at that level. So whilst I understand what everybody's saying, I suppose the key thing we have to understand is that loss. What does that equate to in terms of number of meals per day? What we also know is the government is underfunding our free school meals. We know that. That's the reality. The free school meals does not cover the cost of providing a school meal. So if you've got a child on a free school meal and that standard is £3, then every parent who is on free school meal would have to pay the difference. That's the reality. So I think it's really important we have these conversations, but where we've got a public park and there's a car park and there's a cafe, actually, should we be providing all three? Maybe we should, maybe we shouldn't. Those are the conversations we need to have. But in terms of school meals, I think for me, yes, we should be providing nutritional and good meals for our children. And I clearly am in a minority. I don't know. Richard, in terms of the long-term project in terms of school meals, at what point do we get to break even on the legacy contracts, recycle back? What's our position to break even? Thank you, Chair.
So as the paper sets out, we're forecasting that this year we will still have a small loss within school food. A lot of that is just due to the contracting cycle and when contracts fall for renewal within the year, and it's because of how it works across financial years and academic years and things like that. So that's what means there's still a loss for next year, and why the following year it then goes into making a contribution. So there will have been, a significant turnaround from where we were this time last financial year, and that's partly due to the renegotiation of all those contracts and setting those new commercial deals, and also some significant work restructuring all of our kitchens, which should be aiming to take about £1 million out of our costs. It is right to say that food price inflation did hit scarily high levels. That has moderated somewhat, which has helped, but it's still fair to say food price inflation is strange and is hitting strange sectors at different points in time, which is still making keeping a stable budget within food provisions challenging for the service. And it still does remain the case that funding for free school meals is less than almost all operators within the sector would like to see it at £2.53 per child per meal at the moment. And it remains to be seen if that will be raised this next year by central government, and we don't have any information on that at the moment.
Mr. Boland.
Thank you. If I've just come back to the cafes situation, really just to sort of clarify my understanding on it. So we're looking at the budget position for MTFS as a net contribution of 24k for Beacon Hill, 12k for Tithe Barn. Is that once we've took away sort of repair costs, or do they sit separately? Presumably, if we contracted out to a third party, the contract would include repair and maintenance, generally speaking. So we would have an income, but we wouldn't have any expenditure. Would that be correct? So if so, are we looking quite like for like? If you see what I mean with the figures, and if the contracts do generally speaking include maintenance costs, what advantage would there be in selling a site versus just renting it out as long as maintenance was included? Because presumably we'd have an income of anything but no expenditure on that. That makes sense.
A couple of points on that one. So in terms of the maintenance costs, if we were to let those sites, it would generally run an internal maintaining basis, which is basically exactly the same as they are at the moment. So there are some property costs, but they would be the same whoever was maintaining the facility. So things relating to walls, to roofs, externals, all that kind of thing would still remain the county council's liability if let under the way we normally let premises. So I think it is fair to say those figures would be comparable, because there's obviously the internal costs are already costs that are included within the budget that you see there. So I'd say that's very, very similar. In terms of the question of selling those sites, members will know kind of Beacon Hill, and obviously the cafe is right in the centre of the park. So again, it's not really a site suitable for sale. It would be a site, if we were to look to do something different, you'd be looking to let, I think, that premises rather than sell a chunk out of the centre of the park. And likewise, Tithe Barn being part of Bosworth Battlefield, which is already a site which is with complicated landowners, shall we say, it's not something you'd be doing on that site either. So no, neither of those would be suitable as a sale.
Thank you very much for that. Just to clarify the point on why the contracts don't include maintenance, is it to do with the size of the businesses just being too small to make it commercially viable? I know with obviously bigger premises, it's sort of standard for maintenance to be included. Is it purely that it just wouldn't be commercially viable for anybody to take on a small cafe if maintenance was included?
I think you're right. It's to do with the type and nature of the structure, and also the nature of works that would normally be included in a lease of that size and nature. So normally wouldn't include external works relating to roofs and things like that. So it's more that more complex things. Having said that, something like Beacon Hill Cafe, being of quite recent construction, doesn't have those big ticket items in it anyway at the moment.
It's been. Thank you, Chair. I'm finding it very difficult, really, to have this conversation. I fundamentally agree with what Mrs. Hack said. I'm having a conversation here about the scope and purpose of a theatre. In the same dialogue, I'm having a discussion about free school meals, and I find it's like we've almost, no pun intended, we're mixing the carrots and the peas a little bit. My background is from theatre. And I'd like to just precursor that I come from a culture background. I used to be a drama and theatre lecturer, university lecturer at HE and FE. I'm very passionate about theatre and culture. I appreciate that if we take things like theatres and libraries out of our communities, we become a moribund lunar landscape that lacks any kind of love and joy. So I'd like to precursor that. However, having been a trustee of theatres and worked on a lot of theatres, from the McKinley Theatre in Kettering to our very own theatre in Melton Mowbray, I know what a huge hemorrhaging black hole of finance they really are. One lantern in a theatre can be £1,500, and you only need one of those to go. I know Colville. I've worked in Colville. I like the Colville people. I run a theatre and education project myself, and I have done in Colville. I see the value of that. But I just can't see how justifiably the local authority, Leicestershire County Council, can declare themselves theatre managers, owners and directors. I'm going to ask Richard, to the point really, have we not explored opportunities like large leisure groups, like, in inverted commas, the Warners Group, who actually look after theatres like that? Have we not explored opportunities? Forgive me if we have we not looked at kind of leasing the theatre out, or actually handing it over to organisations who are far better equipped, have far higher levels of expertise in this than we as a local authority may have? And I apologise if we've got colleagues who run the Century Theatre, because I'm sure they're very good, and I have looked at the results and I've seen that they had a very successful Christmas season. I see all that sort of thing. But running a theatre in itself is arguably more complex than running a local authority. They are huge and complex, and they are money pits. And if you were to speak to anybody, a trustee of Curve, they will tell you that without the subsidy of Arts England, even if they sold out night after night, it would be very difficult for them to justify their existence or wash their own face. So just going back to a simple question, have we explored that this is the best modus operandi for us to be working in? And have we actually looked at large leisure groups that may want to take some of that burden away from us and still retain a cultural aspect of Colville? Thank you, Chair.
I think it's absolutely incumbent on us to look at options for all of the services, and I think that's what everybody's said very clearly today. I would say on the specific point of the theatre and kind of big operators, it's important to remember that the Century Theatre is a 200-seat venue. And I think rather the size of the venue precludes interest from large operators, probably. Absolutely taking the broader point you're making is absolutely something we should always be aware of. But I'd say that the size of the theatre really does preclude significant interest, I would have thought.
So effectively, the auditoria, the size of the auditoria hasn't got sufficient amount of seating to cover a hosting theatre company. There isn't enough seats on a ticket price to actually have an organisation like Polka Dot Theatre Company come into it, because there isn't enough people in the audience to basically pay the actors' wages, because it's too small to be operational, arguably.
Obviously, you'll be able to see the breadth of programme that the theatre has, and every show that's put on at the theatre is designed to make sure that there's a decent return from that show. What it does mean that and you will know this obviously professionally, that with a small capacity theatre, it's impossible to have the large big ticket shows that one might see at somewhere like Curve. But the point of small theatres is they make up part of that artistic landscape that you have within a region such as Leicestershire, where you have got major players like Curve and Montfort Hall alongside smaller theatre that operates for local communities. So what you'd see at the Curve is what you'd see at Century Theatre is completely different to Curve, but it's kind of unapologetically so, I guess, given the nature and scale of what is possible in a small venue in a smaller town within the county.
Chair, if I may just come back on one final point. Richard, I want to be very clear. I'm very passionate about the theatre remaining open. I'd pledge my time and support to help you with that as well. We have, with the additional help of Sutty, rescued a few theatres before. So if there's anything we can do to help move that forward, I think it's within our gift to do that. But thank you for continuing with that anyway.
Mr. Richardson and then Mrs.
I just wanted to make a quick point in response to what Amanda said. I mean, I don't think any of us in this room would not want our children to have good quality school meals. The question is, who should pay for it? Now, the schools get the budget to pay for school meals, not the county council. So it's not for the county council to subsidise school meals that go out there. That is not our job. So I accept that we would all want everybody to have school meals. Now, the county council could tomorrow decide it wants to give everybody a fabulous school meal and we could spend 20 million on it. But I don't think it's our job and it's not the responsibility of this council. And language matters. And I was slightly concerned, Richard, with your comment. You said, and you can listen to the tape back if you don't believe me, the school meal service will make a small loss next year. Well, if you think 485,000 is a small loss, I think that actually exemplifies where the problem is. Because 485,000 to me is not small. I don't think any resident listening to this at home would think 485,000 is small. And I appreciate what Declan said about the turnaround, but the turnaround is only needed because the contracts weren't written properly in the first place. So we can go all that like about food inflation. If the contract's been written that the actually service person who uses the service pays those increased costs as any person would have written a contract for such a service, there would not have been a problem. And we would be £4 million better off, which we could do lots of things for our residents, which we no longer have. So our residents are £4 million poorer in services and what we could do for them because of our inability to actually run a service efficiently.
Mrs. Bryan, I think you want to come in.
I think this conversation now and this meeting is slightly deteriorating, I'm afraid, Chair. Two things. And I'm going by paragraph 31 on page 143. D, E are the main ones we should be looking at. Benefits to Leicestershire residents. Now, some of you may live in an area where parents can afford school meals and can afford to go and get good food for their children. Others may be living in an area where the children, their main meal is the meal they get at school. And if we can't supply our children with good food, well then I'd rather get rid of some of the other stuff we have. There's just vanity programs. To my mind, the welfare of our residents in my own area, they even open the schools out for the older people to go and have a meal and to meet the children. What are we here for? I have to ask this. It's not very often I get cross, but listening to some of the discussions this morning, since 10 o'clock, for 4 hours, theatres, okay? I don't very often go to the theatre, but I'm fortunate. I'm only 2.5 miles from Loughborough. I can get into Leicester. Colville is not exactly the centre of the universe. And if they're offering stuff to communities, we have a problem that we haven't touched on here, and that is our younger people. We have more antisocial behaviour than we ever had 20 years ago. And having theatres, good food, communication, our children lost nearly 2 years of social integration. And I should declare an interest. I'm not a teacher, but I have 3 members of my family, ranging from a headmaster to an SEND head at a primary school. Not in Leicestershire, I'll hold my hand up. But, you know, we're not here to make, if we have to do things, I don't know, I just get so cross with some of you. And I just wonder where you come from and how you can do it. Honestly, turn around. I've got children in my street that rely on the school meals. So I hope this discussion isn't going to go on much further, Mr. Chairman, because I'm afraid I'll have to leave.
Thank you, Mrs. Fryer. Does Richard or Declan, Jane, do you want to come back on anything? Last few people have said.
No, I mean, just say that the criteria A to F was to get, I suppose, input from this committee so we can produce that criteria, I suppose, generically initially to sort of just judge services against. So we'll try and incorporate sort of the different points in the discussion that's been had in today to allow us to have that sort of, I suppose, that evaluation framework.
And can we just, obviously, everybody has got their opinion and we value them all and they're all noted, but we all have got to, you know, make decisions. But can we, before we conclude on this item, just look at point 31 again, as I pointed out earlier, and the suggested criteria Richard put forward, whether we all agree to that, so he knows which way to focus for future reports.
Mr. Pope.
Thank you. It's been an interesting discussion at the end of a fairly long meeting, and one, I think someone said that we're going to have a longer session on in April. I think someone said the ways that we're okay. So for me, there's been a lot of members have spoken that have made really sort of made me think Mr. Richardson and Mrs. Fryer at the end there, and it's such a difficult one to sort of make a yes or no decision on at this point, because yes, financial return is vital because councils can go bust. Of course they can, you know. So if we ultimately take that out of it, then we go 1 to 114 like half a dozen other authorities. But ultimately, I would accept the benefits to Leicestershire residents is ultimately the point of us being here. Because if we're not here to do that, what the hell are we here for? So for me, I think it's probably fair to say that should be higher up the list. But how you benefit to residents versus financial return? Because if we go bust, we're not helping anybody, are we? So we almost need a session in its own right on that. But for me, I would put certainly move it higher than D, benefits to Leicestershire residents, to at least B, and then arguably A. And as I said, I'm interested in colleagues' comments.
I do agree with that as well, Mr. Poland. Is that a general view that we should just keep the 6 priorities but move benefits to Leicestershire residents higher up, probably to B? Okay. Any other comments, questions? No, everyone happy? Okay, well, thank you everybody for your contributions today. It's been quite a lengthy meeting, but it's been productive. So thank you, and thank you, Declan, Richard, and Jane, to everyone else who presented, and to all members for the questions, contributions. The next meeting is on the 13th of March at 10 a.m. There's no urgent items, so I bring the meeting to a close. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Chairman.